The morning Harlan Briggs decided to humiliate Clara Whitmore in front of half of Clearwater, he did it with a smile on his face. He walked into her bakery at 7 in the morning, picked up a fresh loaf of sourdough bread she had been up since 4 o'clock baking, turned it over in his thick hands like he was inspecting something pulled from a ditch, and then dropped it on the floor. Not by accident, deliberately. He let it fall, watched it hit the planks, and then looked up at Clara with that flat, satisfied expression men like him wore when they wanted you to know exactly how little you mattered. "Thought I'd see what all the fuss was about," he said, loud enough for the 3 customers near the window to hear. "But I'll tell you something, sweetheart. Nobody's paying good money for bread baked by a woman who can barely fit through her own doorway." The bakery went silent. If you've ever watched a person decide in real time whether to break or hold, you know what Clara's face looked like in that moment. Don't go anywhere. If this story already has you feeling something, tap that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you want to know what Clara did next, and what the loneliest cowboy in Clearwater had to do with all of it, subscribe and stay with me until the very end. The best parts of this story are just getting started. Eat. The bread had taken her 4 hours. She had mixed the starter the night before, left it to rise in the cool back room, shaped it before the sun came up, and timed the oven just right so the crust would crack the way she liked it. Not too hard, not too soft. That particular give that meant the inside would be warm and pull apart clean. She had gotten it right that morning. She knew she had, because she'd pressed her thumb gently against the bottom and heard the hollow sound that told her so. Now it was on the floor of her bakery, and Harlan Briggs was still smiling. Clara Whitmore was 29 years old. She was a large woman, full-bodied and broad-shouldered, with dark hair she kept pinned up off her neck and hands that had been calloused since she was a teenager working her aunt's kitchen back in Missouri. She had come to Clearwater, Wyoming in the early spring of 1884 with $200, a crate of cooking equipment, a recipe box her mother had left her, and the specific kind of stubbornness that grows in women who have been underestimated their entire lives. She had not expected Clearwater to love her. She'd known better than that. But she had not expected Harlan Briggs on her 3rd morning open either. She looked at the bread on the floor. She looked at him, and then she bent down, picked it up, set it back on the counter, and said, in a voice that did not shake even slightly, "You should leave now, Mr. Briggs." The smile stayed on his face, but something shifted behind his eyes. He hadn't expected that. "Now don't get sensitive," he said. "I'm just being honest with you. This is a hard town. People out here, they don't have money to waste on things that don't work." "What doesn't work," Clara said, "is your manners, and I'd appreciate it if you took them outside." One of the women near the window, she turned out to be Ruth Mackey, the schoolteacher's wife, made a small sound that might have been a laugh, quickly swallowed. Harlan's smile went flat. He was used to people looking away when he spoke. He was used to men stepping back and women going quiet. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county. He had a reputation in Clearwater that had been carefully built over 15 years of being the kind of man who did what he wanted and faced no consequences for it. Clara Whitmore, who had been in town less than a week, had just asked him to leave her establishment. He set his hat back on his head, slowly, deliberately. "You won't last a season," he said. Then he walked out. The door swung shut behind him. The bell above it rang once and went still. Clara stood at the counter with her hands flat on the wood, breathing carefully through her nose, and did not let herself move for a long moment. Ruth Mackey stood up from her table. "I'll take 2 loaves," she said, "and whatever that is you have cooling in the back. It smells like cinnamon." Clara looked at her. Ruth was perhaps 55, sharp-eyed, with the no-nonsense expression of a woman who had raised other people's children for 30 years and had seen most varieties of human behavior. She held Clara's gaze without blinking. "2 loaves," Clara said, "and the cinnamon thing. It's a pull-apart roll. It's not done for another 20 minutes. "Then I'll wait," Ruth said and sat back down. That was how Clara Whitmore's first real friendship in Clearwater began, not with warmth and welcome, but with a woman deciding to sit down and wait while the bread finished. Demont. She had found the building through a letter. A distant cousin of a former employer had mentioned it in passing. a small commercial space near the town square in Clearwater, Wyoming, available for reasonable lease terms, owner motivated to rent. She had written to the address twice before getting a reply, and when she finally arrived in person, the space was dirtier than she'd expected, smaller than described, and the back wall had a crack in it that someone had tried to hide with a piece of tin sheeting nailed crookedly over the plaster. She took it anyway. She had spent 3 weeks cleaning, repairing, borrowing tools from the hardware store owner on the promise of first payment after opening, and coaxing the old iron stove in the corner back into working condition through a combination of patience and a great deal of profanity she kept strictly private. She had set up a display counter with 2 boards and a pair of sawhorses until she could afford something better. She had made a sign by hand, Clara's Kitchen, and nailed it above the door herself, standing on a chair that wobbled. On opening morning, 3 people had come in. Ruth Mackey had not been one of them. The 3 who came bought bread and a jar of apple preserves between them, and Clara had gone home that evening and sat at her kitchen table and done the arithmetic and understood that she was going to have to work harder than she already was. She worked harder. Within 2 weeks, the smell of her kitchen had begun to reach people who had not meant to find her. Working men who walked past on their way to the feed store, children who appeared at the window and stared until she gave them the end pieces of bread that would have gone stale otherwise. A rancher's wife who came in for one thing and left with 4 because Clara had mentioned casually that the apple preserves went well with the smoked pork. She could smell the woman's husband cooking across the square on Saturdays. She was building something. She could feel it. And then Harlan Briggs had walked through her door and dropped her bread on the floor with a smile. Why? She learned about him in pieces, the way you learn about dangerous things in a new place. Sideways, from careful people who chose their words. Ruth Mackey told her, on her 3rd visit, that Harlan Briggs had been in Clearwater longer than almost anyone else, and that his cattle operation employed a significant portion of the county's labor. She told her this without editorializing, in the same tone she might use to describe the weather patterns, which Clara understood meant that Ruth had opinions she was choosing not to share yet. The hardware store owner, a quiet man named George Pell, mentioned in passing that Briggs had run 2 other businesses out of their locations on Main Street by various means: delayed supply contracts, social pressure, rumor. He said this while wrapping a box of nails and did not look up from his work. A ranch hand who came in for coffee one afternoon told her, after she'd given him an extra roll without comment, that Briggs didn't like new people setting up businesses he hadn't been consulted about, that he liked to be the one people came to for favors, and that a woman running her own establishment without owing him anything made him uncomfortable in ways he didn't know how to express except by making trouble. Clara listened to all of this. She did not panic. She did not make decisions out of fear. She was practical by nature. Her mother had been practical, and her mother's mother before that, and she had come to understand that practicality was not the absence of feeling, but the decision to act on what was true rather than what was frightening. What was true? Harlan Briggs was a problem she had not anticipated. What was also true? She had survived harder problems than a man with a bad smile and too much money. What she needed, she decided, was to understand Clearwater better. Who the real people were beneath the ones she'd met. What the town actually needed that it was not currently getting. And who, if anyone, might be worth trusting. It was George Pell who first mentioned Eli Morrow. He said it while she was picking up a new set of hinges for her supply cabinet, 3 weeks after opening. She had asked him, idly, who in town she ought to know, meaning merchants, people with practical connections, people who might trade goods or services. George had listed several names, and near the end he'd said, "And there's Eli Morrow out on the Ridge Road, if you ever need anything with horses or leather. Best trainer in the county. He's—" George had paused, turning a hinge over in his hand. "He keeps to himself. But he's fair." "Fair how?" Clara had asked. "He does what he says he'll do," George said, "and he doesn't say things he doesn't mean." She had filed this information away without attaching much importance to it. The leather saddlebag that needed repair appeared 2 weeks later. It was hers. One of the straps had cracked through during her move, and she'd been knotting it closed with twine ever since, which was a solution that was also a nuisance. George told her Morrow was the person to see and gave her directions to the ranch. She drove out on a Tuesday afternoon. The ranch was larger than she had expected. A proper working operation, not a small homestead. The main stable was well built, the fencing clean. A man was working with a horse in the yard, his back to her, moving with the slow, deliberate patience of someone who understood that animals respond to stillness. He did not turn when she drove up. The horse did, ears pivoting, head lifting, but the man kept his hand steady at the horse's neck and let it settle before he turned around. She had been prepared for standoffish. She had been told he kept to himself. She had not been prepared for the face, not because it was handsome, though she supposed it was, in the way that things worn hard by weather and time develop a particular kind of clean severity. She had not been prepared for the expression, which was the specific blankness of a person who has decided that the world at large is not worth the effort of a response. Not hostility, not coldness exactly, just a complete, thorough absence of invitation. Eli Morrow was 35 years old, tall and lean, with dark eyes set under heavy brows, and the kind of stillness in his hands that came from years of working with animals that could feel fear through your fingertips. He looked at her the way he might look at a weather pattern he hadn't decided whether to be concerned about yet. "Mr. Morrow," Clara said. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. "My name is Clara Whitmore. George Pell said you might be able to repair a saddlebag strap. I've got it here if you want to look at it." He looked at her for a moment without speaking, which did not bother her. She waited. "Let's see it," he said. She brought him the bag. He turned it over in his hands, examined the cracked strap, ran his thumb along the break. "Leather's dried out," he said. "Should have been treated last fall." "I know," she said. "I bought it from someone who hadn't taken care of it. Can you fix it?" "I can replace the strap," he said. "Better than fixing. Be stronger." "How much?" He named a price. It was fair, lower than she'd expected, actually. "When can I pick it up?" she asked. 3 days. I'll be here Thursday." She turned to go back to the wagon. She was nearly there when she heard herself say, without having planned to, "You do careful work. I could see it in the fencing in the stable before I even got close. Someone who works like that. It shows." She didn't know why she said it. It was true, and she'd noticed it, and it had come out before she'd made the decision to say it. She heard the silence behind her and didn't turn around. "Thursday," he said finally. "Thursday," she agreed, and climbed back up and turned the wagon around. On Thursday, the strap was replaced exactly as he'd said. The leather was clean and well-oiled, the stitching so even it looked mechanical. She ran her hand along it and then looked up at him. "This is beautiful work," she said. He looked uncomfortable, the way people do when they are genuinely unused to being told something good about themselves. Not embarrassed, just caught off guard, like he'd been standing near a wall and someone had moved the wall without warning. "It's just stitching," he said. "It's not just stitching," she said. "It's stitching done the right way instead of the fast way. There's a difference." He took her money without comment. She was nearly to the wagon again when she heard, in the same flat, uninflected voice he seemed to use for everything, "How's the bakery doing?" She turned. He was not looking at her. He was coiling the excess thread around his fingers, eyes down. "People are finding it," she said. "It takes time." He nodded once, which she took as the end of the conversation, and drove home. She did not plan to go back. There was no immediate reason. But the following Tuesday, she found herself with a basket of extra food. She'd made too large a batch of cornbread and a pot of bean soup that would not keep more than another day. And she thought of the way he'd looked when she complimented his stitching, that unguarded moment. And she thought of what George Pell had said. "He's fair. He does what he says he'll do." And she drove out to the ridge road. There were 4 ranch hands working the east pasture. She brought the basket to the group of them first, which she'd intended to do from the start, and they received it with the particular combination of gratitude and sheepishness that hungry men who are not used to being looked after tend to show. She was handing out the last of the cornbread when Eli came out of the stable. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at the basket. He looked at her. "I made too much," she said. She watched him decide whether to believe that. She could see him working it out. The slight tightening around his eyes, the consideration. She'd been a little too quick with the explanation. He knew it. and she knew he knew it. "I don't need anyone looking after me," he said. "I know," she said. "I brought it for the men. The men ate already." "Then it won't go to waste," she said, and held out the rest of the basket toward him. He didn't take it immediately. There was a long pause in which neither of them moved, and the ranch hands found very pressing reasons to be looking at other things. "Everyone needs to eat," she said. He took the basket. He didn't thank her. He set it down on the fence post beside him and went back into the stable. She drove home. That evening, she told herself she was not going to make a habit of this. She had enough to occupy her time. Harlan Briggs was still making things difficult. He'd spoken to the grain supplier in Laramie, she'd learned, and her next order was going to be delayed for reasons that were not entirely explained. She had a business to run, money to manage, a reputation to build. She did not need to be feeding grudging cowboys who lived on ridge roads and didn't say thank you. She went to sleep telling herself this. The following Thursday, she drove out to the ridge road again with a pot of leftover stew. She was not a woman who misread situations. She knew what she was doing, and she knew why she was doing it, and she knew the risks of it. What she had seen on Eli Morrow's face that first day, that specific blankness that wasn't hostility but was something close to it, she had seen that expression before. She had seen it on her uncle after his farm failed. She had seen it on women in Missouri who had outlived their children. She had seen it on people who had been so thoroughly ground down by something that they had stopped letting themselves want anything, because wanting had become more dangerous than the absence of wanting. She did not know what had happened to Eli Morrow. She hadn't asked, and she didn't intend to, not yet. But she recognized what she saw, and she could not quite make herself stop driving out to that ranch on Ridge Road, because she was the kind of person who could not see something that was suffering and do nothing about it. That was her flaw, probably. Her aunt had told her so. "You can't fix everything, Clara. You'll wear yourself out trying." Maybe. But she could make soup. Not. The fourth time she came, he was sitting on the fence outside the stable, and he watched her drive up without moving. "You don't have to keep coming out here," he said, before she'd climbed down. "I know," she said. "Then why do you?" She thought about it. She could have given him several answers. She could have said it was practical, neighborly, a habit of cooking too much. She could have said it was because his ranch hands had told her, gratefully, that he worked them hard but fair, and that they'd follow him anywhere, and that men who inspired that kind of loyalty usually had some goodness in them worth preserving. She could have said it was because she'd seen the carved wooden deer on the windowsill of his stable, small, intricate, precisely made. And she'd thought about the hands that had made it, that same care he put into the stitching, and she'd wondered what kind of man spent his stillness making something gentle. Instead, she said, "You look like you could use some company." He was quiet for a long moment. Something moved across his face that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but was close to both. "You don't know what I look like," he said. "I know what alone looks like," she said. "I've seen it enough." He climbed down from the fence and took the basket without a word and went back inside. But this time from the doorway, he said, "You want coffee?" She had not been expecting that. "Yes," she said. "I do, Chatswookshad." They drank the coffee on the porch. He didn't talk much. She didn't push him to. She had brought mending. 2 shirts of his she'd noticed had fraying cuffs when she'd been handing food to the ranch hands. And she worked while the coffee cooled between them. The evening came in from the east, and somewhere in the hills a bird made a sound she didn't recognize. "What's that bird?" she asked. "Mountain thrush," he said. "They come through this time of year." "Do they stay?" "No," he said. "Just passing." She stitched the cuff of the first shirt and moved to the second. He watched her hands work, not the way men sometimes watched her with that assessing, dismissive quality she'd learned to recognize. He watched the way you watch someone do something you understand the difficulty of, with quiet attention. "You sew well," he said. "My mother taught me," she said. She said hands that couldn't cook and sew were hands that hadn't been paying attention. "Where's your mother now?" "Gone," she said. 6 years ago." He nodded, and his nod had a weight in it that told her he understood what gone meant, not as a direction, but as a permanence. "I'm sorry," he said, and it was the most natural thing he'd said to her in all the time she'd been coming out to the ranch. No performance in it, just the plain, honest word. "Thank you," she said. The mountain thrush called again. Clara finished the second shirt and folded both and set them on the porch rail. Eli drank the last of his coffee and turned the cup in his hands. "You don't talk about yourself much," he said, "for someone who comes around as often as you do." "You don't ask," she pointed out. He considered this. "Where did you come from?" he said. It was not quite a question. "Missouri. Small town outside of Columbia. My aunt ran a boarding house. I grew up in the kitchen." "Why Clearwater?" "The space was available. The price was right. And nobody I knew had ever heard of it, which meant nobody had an opinion about what I should do there." Something almost changed in his face. Not a smile exactly, but the muscles around his eyes shifted, and she had the feeling that in different circumstances, with a different kind of life behind him, it might have been a smile. "Harlan Briggs has opinions," he said. "I've noticed. He's been telling people you'll be gone by summer." "He's wrong," she said. "I know," Eli said. "I told him so." She looked at him. He was looking at the hills, not at her. "You talked to Harlan Briggs about me?" she said. "He came out here to talk horses. He mentioned you as though he expected me to find it interesting that there was a new woman in town who was going to fail at her business. I told him he was probably wrong." Eli's voice was flat and even, as though he were describing a minor adjustment to fence wire. He didn't like that. Clara was quiet for a moment. "Why did you say that?" she asked. "You didn't know me yet." He turned and looked at her directly, which he did not do often. When he did, it had a quality of full attention that was slightly startling, like a spotlight being aimed suddenly at something that had been comfortably in shadow. "You came out here the first day and looked at my work and called it careful," he said. "And you didn't do it to flatter me. You said it because it was true and you'd noticed. People who pay attention like that, they don't usually fail at things." Clara looked at her hands in her lap. "That might be the kindest thing anyone in this county has said to me," she said. "It's just accurate," he said. She stood to leave. The sky had gone the deep blue that comes just before full dark. She picked up her empty basket and descended the porch steps. "Clara," he said. She stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for the food." She looked back at him. He was a tall shadow against the lamplight from the window, one hand on the porch post, and he looked, for just that moment, like a man who had remembered that he existed. "You're welcome," she said. "Thursday." "Thursday," he said. She drove home with her hand steady on the reins and the mountain thrush still calling somewhere in the dark hills behind her, and she did not let herself feel anything too specific about any of it, because she was a practical woman and she understood that hope, unmanaged, was just a different kind of trouble. But she drove home a little faster than usual. And when she got in and lit the lamp, she found herself standing at the kitchen table for a long moment, without remembering why she'd gone there. She started the next day's bread and did not let herself think about it further, which was, she knew perfectly well, its own kind of thinking about it. The grain order came in 3 weeks late, and when it finally arrived, half of it was wrong. Clara stood at the back door of her kitchen and looked at the delivery. 2 sacks of the coarse ground cornmeal she had not ordered, a barrel of the wrong grade of flour, and only one of the 3 tins of baking powder she had specifically requested in writing, and she breathed carefully through her nose for a count of 5, and then told the delivery man pleasantly that she would need a receipt for what had actually arrived so she could document the discrepancy. The delivery man, who was young and apologetic and not responsible for any of it, gave her the receipt and left quickly. She sat down at her work table with the receipt and the original order and compared them, line by line. And when she was finished, she set both papers flat on the table and pressed her palms on top of them, and thought about Harlan Briggs. She had no proof. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. She had no proof that the supply irregularities were connected to him. Grain shipments got mixed up. Deliveries got delayed. These were ordinary frontier problems that happened to ordinary businesses for entirely ordinary reasons. She knew this. She also knew that George Pell had quietly mentioned when she'd gone in for hinges 2 weeks ago that Briggs had a cousin who worked dispatch for the Laramie Freight Company that handled most of the commercial supply routes into Clearwater. He'd mentioned it without looking at her, which was how George mentioned things he thought she needed to know but didn't want to have said. Clara wrote a careful letter to the freight company in Laramie. She wrote a second letter to a supplier in Cheyenne she'd heard about from a woman at the Thursday market, asking about direct delivery arrangements and pricing. She kept both copies. She kept every receipt. She had started a ledger the day she opened, and she recorded everything in it. Every delivery, every discrepancy, every date. Her mother had taught her to keep records. "You think you'll remember?" her mother had said. "You won't. Write it down." She wrote it all down. Then she got up, corrected the flour issue as best she could with what she had, and opened the bakery at 7 o'clock because people were waiting and they needed their bread, and she was not going to let Harlan Briggs's cousin in Laramie take that from them. Ruth Mackey arrived at 7:30, which was later than usual. She sat at her regular table near the window and ordered coffee and 2 of the small oat rolls, and then she said, in the particular tone she used when she had information and had decided to share it, "I heard something this morning you should probably know." Clara poured the coffee and sat down across from her because there were no other customers yet, and Ruth was not a woman who talked around things. "Briggs has been speaking to the Morrison family," Ruth said. "Specifically to James Morrison, who owns the building you're leasing." Clara was quiet. "He's suggesting," Ruth continued, "that Morrison might find it more profitable to repurpose this space for storage. Briggs apparently has use for a storage facility near the square and is willing to pay above market rate." "My lease runs 18 months, Clara said. "Yes," Ruth said. "I imagine that's why it's a suggestion right now and not an action." Clara turned her coffee cup in her hands. "Is Morrison the kind of man who can be persuaded to break a lease?" Ruth considered this with the careful fairness she applied to most things. "James Morrison is a decent man who is also a practical man who has 3 daughters to settle and a farm that had a bad year in '82 that he hasn't entirely recovered from." She paused. "He is the kind of man who can be persuaded, under the right pressures, to do things he would prefer not to do." "How long do I have before the suggestion becomes something more serious?" "That I don't know," Ruth said, "but I would start thinking about what you'd do if the lease became a problem." Clara nodded. She was already thinking about it. She had been thinking about it since Harlan Briggs had dropped her bread on the floor and smiled. Because she was not a woman who waited for trouble to arrive. She was a woman who tried to see it coming while she still had room to move. "Thank you, Ruth," she said. "Eat something," Ruth said, and picked up her oat roll. "You look like you've been up since before the birds." 4 o'clock, Clara said. Ruth shook her head in the way that meant she was not going to comment on that but thought it was excessive, which was, in its way, also a form of care. She told Eli about it on Thursday. She had not intended to. She had driven out with a pot of leftover potato soup and a loaf of the rye bread that had turned out particularly well despite the flour situation, and she had meant to keep the visit light because she was tired and he was not a man who responded well to being brought other people's problems. But he asked how the week had gone, which was becoming something he did. This small shift in his behavior toward her that she was careful not to make too much of, and it came out before she'd fully decided to say it. She told him about the grain order. She told him about Ruth's information. She told him, in plain terms, what she understood the situation to be. Eli listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd come to appreciate about him. Most people interrupted. He sat across from her on the porch with his coffee and let her get through the whole thing before he spoke. "Morrison's building or yours?" he said. "His building. I lease it." "You looked at the lease agreement before you signed it." "Of course I did." "Are there grounds for early termination on his side?" "Only non-payment of rent or damage to the property. I've done neither." He nodded slowly. "Then Briggs can offer him whatever he wants. Morrison can't act on it without cause." "Not legally," Clara said. "But people find ways around what's legal when the incentive is large enough." Eli looked at her, and there was something in his expression that she'd noticed before, a kind of recognition, like she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected about her. "You've dealt with this kind of thing before," he said. "Not this exactly," she said, "but yes. There are always men like Briggs, in every town, in every situation. Men who have more than they need and still can't tolerate someone doing well without their permission." He was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" he said. "Keep records," she said. "Find alternate suppliers so the freight delays can't cut me off from what I need. Make myself useful enough to enough people in this town that it costs Briggs more to push me out than to leave me alone." She paused. "And build the kind of relationship with Morrison that makes him see me as a person, not a line item." Eli turned his coffee cup in his hands. He did that when he was thinking, she'd noticed. The same motion. "James Morrison comes to me twice a year for horsework," he said. "He's bringing a mare in next month for training. I could mention you. Not as a favor. Just mention the bakery. He doesn't know you." She looked at him. "You do that?" He shrugged, which on him was a different gesture than it was on other people. It wasn't dismissal. It was the way he indicated something was simple when he didn't want to make it larger than it was. "I'm not going to lie to him," Eli said. "I'll just tell him the truth, which is that you run an honest business and you're not going anywhere." Clara felt something move in her chest that she identified and then firmly set aside. "Thank you," she said. "It might not matter." "I know," she said. "It still counts." He looked at her briefly, that direct gaze that still sometimes caught her off guard, and then looked back at his coffee. "You should talk to someone who knows contract law," he said. "There's a man named Aldrich in Laramie. Not a full lawyer, but he understands land and property agreements. He helped me with a boundary dispute 2 years ago. Charges fairly." "I'll write to him," she said. "I'll give you his address." He went inside and came back with a scrap of paper on which he'd written, in a slow, deliberate hand, a name and an address. She looked at it. The handwriting was not what she'd expected. Careful, almost architectural, each letter fully formed. "You have good handwriting," she said. "My wife taught me," he said. It was the first time he had mentioned her. He said it without apparent intention, the way you let something slip that has been sitting near the surface of your thoughts without your permission. He caught himself saying it, and his jaw tightened slightly. Clara did not react. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket. "I'll write to him Monday," she said. Eli nodded. They sat for a while without speaking, and it was not uncomfortable, the way silence between strangers is uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who had learned something about each other and had not yet decided what to do with it. The bakery kept growing, not quickly. Nothing in Clara's life had ever happened quickly, and she had made a kind of peace with that, but steadily, the way good things tend to grow when they're not being rushed. By the beginning of June, she had regular customers, which meant people who came not just because they happened to be passing, but because they had planned to come. The ranch hands from 3 different operations stopped in on Saturday mornings. The school teacher's family took a standing order for 2 loaves weekly. A woman named Dora Chen, who ran the laundry 2 streets over and who Clara liked immediately for her directness and complete indifference to other people's opinions, began coming in every other day for coffee and whatever Clara had made that morning that Dora described as whatever looks least fancy, which was her way of saying she wanted something filling and honest without pretension. Dora was 43, a widow, and had been running her laundry since her husband died 6 years ago. She had the kind of practical toughness that came from having survived something hard and having decided afterward that she had very limited patience for nonsense. "You know what your problem is," Dora said one morning, in the way she said most things, as an observation, not a criticism. "Tell me," Clara said. "You're too useful to everyone else and not useful enough to yourself." Dora accepted a cup of coffee with both hands and drank from it immediately before it had fully cooled. "You're feeding half the county and mending Eli Morrow's shirts and writing letters to suppliers in Cheyenne to fix problems that Briggs created, and all of that is fine. But what are you doing that's for you?" "The bakery is for me," Clara said. "The bakery is your work," Dora said. "That's different." Clara was quiet, because Dora was not wrong, and she knew it. "I'm fine," Clara said. "I didn't say you weren't fine," Dora said. "I'm saying fine isn't the ceiling." Clara handed her a piece of corn cake without comment. Dora ate it and did not press the point further, which was another thing Clara appreciated about her. Dora said a thing once. She did not repeat herself. And it was Dora who told her about Eli's wife. She said it carefully, in the matter-of-fact way she handled everything, but Clara could tell she was being deliberate about how she framed it. Not gossip, not pity, but information she thought Clara needed to have. Her name had been Alice. She had died 3 years ago. Childbed fever, after a labor that had gone wrong, and the baby with her. Eli had found them in the morning. He had been out on a night emergency with one of the horses and had not been there, and that part of the story was told in Clearwater in hushed voices because people understood, without saying it plainly, that it had broken something in him that had not mended. He blamed himself, Dora said, which doesn't make sense because there's nothing he could have done, but that's not how grief works, is it? No, Clara said, it isn't. He shut everything down after that, kept the ranch running because the work kept him alive, but that was about all. Wouldn't come to town if he could avoid it. Stopped going to any of the social things he used to go to. People tried for a while and then stopped trying because he made it clear enough that he didn't want it. Dora turned her coffee cup. He was good before that, not a warm man. He's never been warm, that's just his nature, but present. There's a difference between a man who's quiet and a man who's gone. Yes, Clara said, there is. He's different since you started going out there, Dora said. Clara looked at her. How do you know about that? George Pell, Dora said simply. He notices things. Clara thought about saying something deflecting. She thought about pointing out that she went out there with food for the ranch hands and that it was practical, neighborly, not anything more than that. She thought about all of these things and instead said nothing, which was the most honest response available. I'm not making it into anything, Dora said. I'm just telling you that people have noticed, and that the thing they've noticed is that he's different. She paused. Better different. Not as far gone. Clara picked up a cloth and wiped down the counter because she needed something to do with her hands. He's a hard man to get close to, she said. Yes, Dora said. He's still carrying a lot. Yes, Dora said. He is. They did not say more about it. They did not need to. On the second Thursday of June, Clara arrived at the ranch to find Eli in an argument. She heard it from the gate, not shouting exactly, but voices raised past the point of civility, and she recognized one of them as belonging to a man named Walt Cruz, who ran a smaller ranch to the north, and who she had heard mentioned in town as a man with a temper and a tendency to carry grievances past their natural expiration. She pulled the wagon to a stop and sat for a moment, assessing. Eli was standing in the yard outside the stable, arms crossed, and across from him was Walt Cruz, red-faced and leaning forward in the posture of a man who wanted to be physically threatening without quite committing to it. Two of Eli's ranch hands were visible near the fence, watching without intervening, which told her they'd seen this before and knew where the line was. You said the horse would be ready in 6 weeks, Cruz was saying. It's been 8. I said 6 weeks if he progressed the way I expected, Eli said. He didn't. He's got a trust problem. Rushing him would undo everything I've done. I don't pay you to tell me about trust problems, Cruz said. I pay you to have my horse ready. Then you're going to have to decide whether you want a horse that's ready or a horse that's actually trained, Eli said. Because those are different things. Don't talk to me like I'm stupid, Cruz said. I'm talking to you like you're a man who's asking me to cut corners on work you paid me to do correctly, Eli said. If you want the horse back in the condition he was when he arrived, say the word. I'll refund the deposit for the weeks remaining. Clara climbed quietly down from the wagon and stayed by the fence. She did not announce herself. This was not her situation. You'd like that, wouldn't you? Cruz said. Pocket my money and send me home with nothing. I'm offering you a refund, Eli said. That's not pocketing anything. I heard about you, Cruz said, and his voice took on a different quality. Lower, more deliberate. The kind of voice men used when they decided to be cruel. Everyone in this county knows your story. Lost your wife, lost your nerve, and now you sit out here on this ridge and play at work because you've got nothing else. A man like that, you think I'm taking horse advice from him? The ranch hands at the fence both went very still. Eli did not move. Whatever happened in his face, it happened, and then it was gone. And what was left was the flat, complete stillness Clara had seen on him before. Not emptiness, but control. The specific control of someone who has learned to hold things with both hands rather than let them throw him. The horse is in stall 4, Eli said. You can take him today if you want. I'll have your paperwork ready in 20 minutes. Cruz stared at him. He had expected something else. Anger, defensiveness, maybe collapse. He had not gotten any of it. Keep the horse, Cruz said finally. Just have him ready by end of month. I'll have him ready when he's ready, Eli said. Cruz made a sound of disgust and turned and nearly walked directly into Clara, who had taken a few steps forward without meaning to. He looked at her. The same quick, dismissive assessment she'd gotten from Briggs, and then something more complicated. Recognition, maybe. She was the new bakery woman. He'd heard about her too. He walked past without speaking. Clara waited until she heard his horse on the road, then walked up to Eli. He had not moved. His arms were still crossed, and he was staring at the middle distance in that way he did when something had gotten into him deeper than he intended to show. "You're all right?" she said. "Fine," he said. That was unfair. "It's a fair business disagreement," he said. "I meant the other part," she said. "What he said about your wife." He looked at her. His expression was difficult to read. Not blank this time, but guarded in a way that was somehow harder than blank, because guarded meant there was something on the other side of it he was actively protecting. "How much did you hear?" he said. "Enough," she said. He uncrossed his arms and looked away. "People in this town have a long memory and not much else to occupy it." "Does it bother you?" she asked. "What they say." "It bothers me," he said, "that they think they know what happened." "What did happen?" she asked. She had not planned to ask it. It was the kind of thing she usually let people offer rather than reaching for. But she asked it, and she couldn't take it back, and she did not entirely want to. He was quiet for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "I wasn't there," he said. "When it happened. I wasn't there." He said it without looking at her, in a voice that was even and controlled and somehow all the worse for it. "And I've spent 3 years telling myself that it wouldn't have mattered if I had been, because there was nothing anyone could have done. And most days I believe that." He stopped. "Most days." Clara stood beside him and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that was not going to be inadequate, and she understood that what he needed was not words. After a while he said, "She would have liked you." Clara felt the air change, very slightly, the way it does just before weather. "Tell me about her," she said. He looked at her then, and something in his face shifted. Not open, not yet, but less closed than it had been a moment ago, like a window that has been sealed a long time and someone has just moved the latch without opening it yet. "Her name was Alice," he said. "She had an argument for everything, and she was usually right, which I found irritating and also essential." He stopped, started again. "She made this ranch into something. Not the work. I'd been doing the work before she came, but the rest of it. She made it feel like a place where something was happening instead of just a location where a man slept." Clara said nothing. She waited. "After she was gone," he said, "I kept working. I didn't know what else to do. Working meant I didn't have to be still. Still was the problem. Still was when I had to." He stopped. "I don't know how to explain it." "I know," Clara said. He looked at her sharply. "After my mother died," she said, "I cooked for 3 days straight, just kept cooking, made food for everyone in the boarding house, made food for the neighbors, made food for people I barely knew, because cooking meant I was doing something, and doing something meant the other thing had to wait." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "That's it." They stood there in the yard as the afternoon went long and golden around them, and Clara thought about all the ways that grief takes a person, and how the ones who come out of it are usually not the ones who did it faster or better, but just the ones who kept finding something, anything, to put their hands to until the worst of it passed. She stayed later than usual. They ate the potato soup together on the porch, and she told him about the supply problem and the letter from the Cheyenne supplier and the contact in Laramie, and he listened and asked questions, practical questions about terms and timing, and she answered them and found herself grateful, genuinely and specifically grateful, for someone who engaged with her problems as problems to be solved rather than symptoms of her inadequacy. "You think this Aldrich can help you with the lease language?" Eli said. "I think he can tell me what I'm actually dealing with," Clara said, "which is the first thing." "When's Morrison bringing the mayor in?" 3 weeks. I'll introduce you." She looked at him. "You remembered." He shrugged. "I said I would." They were quiet. A ranch hand named Benson crossed the yard toward the bunkhouse and raised a hand in their direction, and Eli returned it, and Clara noticed that the exchange, small, ordinary, the kind of thing that happens between people who know each other, had an ease in it that she had not seen in him before. Some of the held-tight quality was less than it had been. "Eli," she said. That thing Cruz said, about you having nothing else." She chose her words. "He was wrong, but I want to ask you something, and tell me if I'm out of line." He looked at her. "Is this enough for you?" she asked. "The ranch, the work? Are you living, or are you just keeping yourself occupied?" The question landed, and she watched him receive it, watched him decide whether to be offended. He was quiet long enough that she started to think she had gone too far, that she had pushed past whatever careful boundary they had established, that this was the thing that would make him shut back down. Then he said, "I don't know." It was the most honest thing she had ever heard him say. Not, "I'm fine," not, "it's enough," not a deflection or a performance, just, "I don't know." "Okay," she said. "That's all you have to say about it?" "You answered honestly," she said. "That's already more than most people would do." He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely name, something between relief and the specific discomfort of a person who has been seen more clearly than they intended. "You're a strange woman, Clara Whitmore," he said. "I've been told," she said. She stood and picked up the empty soup pot. "Thursday." "Thursday," he said. She was 3 steps off the porch when he said, "It's better. When you come." He said it at a volume that suggested he had not quite made the decision to say it, had perhaps expected to keep it to himself, and it had come out anyway. She stopped. She did not turn around. "Good," she said, and kept walking. She drove home in the dark with the empty pot rattling in the wagon bed and the stars very close overhead, the way they got in Wyoming when the sky felt like something you could reach up and touch, and she let herself feel, just for a little while, the things she had been carefully managing ever since the first Thursday she had driven out to the Ridge Road. It was not uncomplicated. She knew that. He was a man who was still finding his way out of something enormous, and she was a woman who had a business to protect, and a landlord who might be pressured out of her lease, and a supply chain being quietly sabotaged by a man who smiled when he dropped bread on the floor. She had enough to manage. She did not need to add something fragile and important to the list of things she was trying to keep from breaking. But she was practical, and practicality meant accounting for what was true. And what was true, driving home in the Wyoming dark with the stars overhead and the sound of the horse's hooves steady on the road, was that something had shifted, quietly and without her full permission, and she was not sure she wanted to shift it back. She got home. She lit the lamp. She started the next day's bread. And when she finally lay down to sleep, she did not make herself think about anything in particular, because some things are better left to settle on their own, like dough left overnight. You don't keep checking on it. You just trust that by morning something useful will have happened, and you go from there. The letter from Aldrich and Laramie arrived on a Monday, which was Clara's longest day, and she read it standing at the counter between the morning rush and the noon crowd with flowers still on her forearms. It was 4 pages, written in the dense, precise hand of a man who charged by the hour and wanted you to know he was thorough. She read it twice. The first time she read it looking for good news. The second time she read it looking for what was actually there. What was actually there was not good news exactly, but it was not disaster either. It was information, which was what she had asked for, and information was always better than not knowing even when what you learned was difficult. The lease she had signed with James Morrison was legitimate and enforceable. The 18-month term was binding on both parties. However, and this was the part she read 3 times, there was a clause in paragraph 7 that she had read and not fully understood when she signed, which Aldrich had underlined and annotated in the margin with the word "problem" in capital letters, which she appreciated for its clarity. The clause allowed the landlord to terminate the lease in the event of a material change in the building's intended use, provided he gave 60 days' notice and returned all prepaid rent. What constituted a material change in intended use was not defined in the lease. Aldrich's opinion, offered with the caution of a man who had been wrong before and knew it, was that this clause was vague enough to be used against her if Morrison chose to, particularly if Briggs was willing to offer him something substantial enough to absorb the legal risk of a dispute. He recommended she consult an actual attorney in Cheyenne if things moved in that direction, and he gave her a name. He also recommended, in a postscript that felt almost like an afterthought, but probably wasn't, that she make herself indispensable to the community in ways that would make any action against her public and costly. Public pressure, he noted, was often more effective than legal pressure in small towns where reputation was currency. Clara set the letter down, finished her coffee, which had gone cold, and thought about this. She was already doing most of what he recommended, but apparently she needed to do it faster and more visibly. She needed Clearwater to understand before Briggs made his next move that Clara Whitmore's kitchen was not a convenience they could live without. She put the letter in the ledger box with her other records, washed her arms, and started on the noon bread. She told Eli on Thursday. He listened without interrupting, as he always did, and when she finished, he asked the same question he always asked first, which was what she was planning to do. She told him about the postscript, about indispensability, about making herself visible in ways that cost Briggs more than they gained him. "The summer festival," Eli said. She looked at him. "Clearwater does a summer gathering," he said. "End of July. It's been running for 12 years. People come in from 3 counties. Morrison's involved in organizing it. He runs the livestock display." He paused. "They've never had a proper food operation. People bring their own or go without. Briggs sponsored the supply tent 2 years running, which means he controls what's available and marks it up." Clara was very still. "If you set up a food stand at the festival," Eli said, "and you do it right, you'll serve half the county in one afternoon. Every family that comes through that line is a family that knows your name and knows what you can do." He turned his coffee cup. "And it takes the supply tent from Briggs, which won't make him happy, but it makes it harder for him to claim you're not an established part of this community." Clara thought about this. "Who do I talk to about getting a spot?" "Harold Fitch runs the layout. He's at the feed store on Wednesdays." "Do you know him?" "Well enough." She looked at him across the porch. He was doing it again, that thing where he offered help in the flattest possible voice, as though it cost him nothing, as though he hadn't just provided the most useful strategic suggestion anyone had offered her since she arrived in Clearwater. She had come to understand that this was how he was built. He did not make gestures large. He just made them real. "You've been thinking about this," she said. "I've been thinking about Briggs and what he's likely to do next," Eli said. "Same thing you've been doing. Why?" He looked at her, the directness again, sudden and complete. "Because what he's doing is wrong," he said, "and because—" He stopped. He looked away. "Because it matters what happens to your business." The words landed in a specific way, not the what he said, but the because. The admission that her business mattered to him, not as a community concern or an abstract principle, but specifically, personally. She watched him realize he'd said more than he'd intended, and she did what she always did when that happened, which was receive it without making it larger than he was comfortable with. "I'll go see Harold Fitch on Wednesday," she said. "I'll go with you," he said. "He responds better to people he knows." "You hate going into town." "I don't hate it," he said. "I just find it unnecessary most of the time." He finished his coffee. This would be necessary. Harold Fitch was a barrel-shaped man of 60, with a handshake that could compress coal and a manner that was not unfriendly but required you to make a case for yourself before it softened. He looked at Clara when Eli introduced them, and she could see him categorizing her. New woman, bakery, large, unfamiliar. And she let him do it and didn't shift or adjust herself in any way, because she had learned that the adjustment was the thing that cost you. Men like Harold Fitch respected people who stood still. "Clara's interested in the food operation at the festival," Eli said. "She runs the best kitchen in Clearwater." "The only kitchen in Clearwater," Fitch said. He looked at Clara. "Briggs has had the supply tent for 2 years." "I know," Clara said. "I'm proposing something different. Not a supply tent, a food service. Hot food, fresh bread, proper meals. People can sit down and eat. I'll run it myself with 2 helpers, and I'll donate 10% of the day's proceeds to the festival fund." Fitch looked at her for a moment. "What kind of food?" "Whatever's practical for the scale and the weather," she said. Bean and pork stew, cornbread, pickled vegetables, possibly a roast if the weather cooperates. Simple food made well. Briggs has already approached me about the tent for this year, Fitch said. I know, Clara said again. I'm approaching you too. You can make a decision based on what serves the people who come to this festival. Fitch looked at Eli. She always like this? Pretty much, Eli said. Something shifted in Fitch's expression. Not warmth exactly, but the particular shift that happens in practical men when they encounter another practical person and recognize the type. The tent space in the east corner is bigger, Fitch said. Better flow from the main area. Briggs had the small tent near the livestock pens. People had to go looking for it. The east corner would be fine, Clara said. I'll need your setup plan in writing, 3 weeks out. You'll have it in 2, she said. Fitch looked at her again. Then he looked at Eli. I heard Briggs say she'd be gone by summer. You heard wrong, Eli said. Fitch nodded, once, in the manner of a man who had reached a conclusion and was done deliberating. East corner, he said. 10% to the fun, like you said. I'll draw up the agreement. Clara left the feed store with the morning sun in her face and did not allow herself to show how much the yes had meant, because showing it meant letting people see how much it had been in doubt, and she had learned that the appearance of confidence was sometimes the same as having it. Eli fell into step beside her on the boardwalk. That went well, he said. Yes, she said. You're not going to acknowledge that I called you the best kitchen in Clearwater. She looked at him. The corner of his mouth had moved, very slightly, in a way she'd noticed twice before, and was beginning to understand was the closest he came to a smile when something genuinely pleased him. You said the only kitchen in Clearwater, she pointed out. I said the best, he said. Fitch said the only, different speakers. She laughed. It came out before she'd decided to, clean and real, and she saw him look at her when it happened with an expression that wasn't quite the one he usually wore. Open, briefly, like a window before someone remembers it's cold. They walked back to where she'd left the wagon. He helped her up without asking, his hand steady at her elbow for the seconds it took, and then stepped back. Thank you, she said, for coming with me. Fitch is a reasonable man, Eli said. He just needed to see you with someone he trusted. Is that what you are? She asked. Someone he trusts? In matters of work, Eli said. Yes. She picked up the reins. She was going to say something straightforward and leave it at that. Instead, she said, You should come to the festival, not just to help, to be there. It's been a while since you've been somewhere like that. He looked at her, and she could see him preparing to decline, putting together the particular arrangement of words that would make the refusal sound practical rather than afraid. You don't have to run the food tent, she said. You can just be a person who's there. I'll think about it, he said. It was not yes. But it was not no either, and from Eli Morrow, that was something to work with. The weeks between that Wednesday and the festival were the busiest Clara had been since opening, which was saying something. She was running the bakery, planning the festival menu, coordinating with 2 women she'd recruited to help. Bess Arnott, who was 17 and strong and quick, and Dora Chen, who had agreed to spend the festival day helping on the condition that Clara never called it volunteering, because Dora did not volunteer. She participated, and the distinction mattered to her. She was also keeping her eye on Briggs. He had not come back into her bakery since the first morning, but she heard things. Ruth heard things, and passed them along with the practical efficiency of someone who understood that information was a form of protection. Dora heard things from her laundry clients, who talked while they waited, and who said more than they probably intended to in the uncomplicated presence of a woman folding their shirts. What she was hearing was that Briggs was unhappy about the festival. He had gone to Harold Fitch directly, apparently, after word got out about Clara's spot in the east corner, and Fitch had told him, in the flat manner that was Fitch's only manner, that the arrangement had been made and he didn't rearrange arrangements. Briggs had then apparently suggested that the livestock display might benefit from additional sponsorship, which was the kind of suggestion that had a threat built into it. And Fitch had apparently responded by thanking him for the offer and saying he'd keep it in mind, which was the kind of response that had a refusal built into it. Ruth told her all of this on a Tuesday, eating an oat roll. Fitch doesn't like being pressured, Ruth said. Briggs should know that by now. Why doesn't he? Because Briggs has spent 15 years getting what he wants by applying pressure, Ruth said. When it doesn't work on someone, he doesn't adjust his approach. He just applies more pressure. What happens when he runs out of pressure to apply? Ruth considered this. I don't know, she said. I've never seen him run out. Clara thought about Aldrich's letter, about the paragraph 7 clause, about 60 days' notice and returned prepaid rent. Has he spoken to Morrison again? She asked. Not that I've heard, Ruth said, but Morrison's been quieter than usual at the market. Could mean nothing. She paused. Could mean something. Clara nodded. She made a note to find a reason to speak with James Morrison before the festival. Not about the lease, not directly. Just to be a person to him rather than a name on a contract. Eli had said Morrison was bringing the mare in at the end of the month. She would find a reason to be at the ranch when that happened. She was not above strategy. She had never pretended to be above it. The third week of July, she drove out to the Ridge Road on a Thursday and found Eli working a young horse she hadn't seen before, a gray, 3 or 4 years old, with the particular wild quality of an animal that had not yet decided whether humans were worth tolerating. He was working the horse in the paddock with a long line, not breaking it, not forcing anything, just moving with it in circles, letting it set the pace, his body language utterly calm in a way that took effort. She knew he wasn't showing. She watched from the fence for a long time. He didn't acknowledge her, but she saw him register her presence, a slight change in the angle of his head, nothing more. He kept working. The horse kept circling. Gradually, slowly, the horse's pace settled. The tension in its neck went from high and braced to something lower, less defended. When he finally stopped and let the horse stand, he came to the fence, and his face had the specific quality it always had after this kind of work. Settled, more open than usual, like the stillness had gotten into him the same way it got into the horse. Whose horse? She asked. Mine, he said. Found her in the north pasture last month. Strayed from somewhere. Nobody's claimed her. She's beautiful. She's trouble, he said, but his voice had something in it when he said it that was not complaint. You like trouble, Clara said. He looked at her, and this time the corner of his mouth moved and kept moving, and it was a real smile, partial and brief and clearly unfamiliar on his face, like a muscle being used after a long time of not being used. Don't tell anyone, he said. She laughed, and he looked at her again when she did it, that same briefly open expression she'd been noticing. She had stopped pretending not to notice it. James Morrison arrived 20 minutes later with his mare, a solid bay with a calm temperament and a hitch in her left rear gate that Morrison described badly and Eli diagnosed correctly in about 90 seconds of watching her walk. Clara was still at the fence when Morrison came through the gate, and Eli introduced them with the economy of a man who considered introductions a formality but performed them correctly. Clara runs the kitchen in town, Eli said. Morrison was a lean man of perhaps 50, sun-darkened, with the careful eyes of someone who managed money closely because he'd had to. He shook her hand and studied her with the same care he'd probably given the mare's gait. I've heard about your place, he said. My wife went in last month. She said the bread was… What was the word she used? He thought about it. Honest. That's the best thing anyone said about my bread, Clara said. She meant it as a compliment. I took it as one. Something in his face eased slightly. You're doing the food at the summer festival, he said. East Corner tent, she said. You should bring your family. We'll be running from mid-morning to late afternoon. We'll be there for the livestock display, he said. So yes, I suppose we will. He turned back to Eli to discuss the mare, and Clara stayed near the fence and listened to them talk about the horse, the training plan, the timeline, the specific work Eli thought would help. And she watched Eli in professional mode, which was a different thing than Eli at ease on the porch. He was precise, clear, direct, without being blunt. He answered Morrison's questions before Morrison finished asking them, not because he was interrupting, but because he'd anticipated them. Morrison watched him with the respect of a man who knew competence when he saw it. When Morrison left an hour later, Eli came back to where Clara was standing by the fence. He seems like a decent man, she said. He is, Eli said. He's also a man who's been squeezed before and doesn't like it and won't make himself vulnerable to it if he can avoid it. Is that why you think he might do what Briggs wants? No, Eli said. I think he might do it because he's worried about his daughters, and Briggs has money, and there are things money can solve that decency can't. He leaned on the fence rail. But I also think he's the kind of man who, once he's made up his mind that someone is worth standing by, stays stood. How do I make him think that about me? Eli looked at her sidelong. You're already doing it, he said. You did it just now. You didn't sell him anything. You just talked to him. I'm not performing anything, she said, slightly defensive. I know, he said. That's what I mean. 3 days before the festival, Harlan Briggs came to the bakery again. He came in the afternoon when the morning crowd had cleared and Clara was in the back doing prep work for the festival. Bess Arnott was at the counter, and Bess came to the back door and said quietly, Mr. Briggs is here, with the expression of someone reporting the presence of a large weather event. Clara wiped her hands and went out front. Briggs was standing at the counter, hat in hand, which was a change from last time. He was wearing his Sunday-quality clothes on a Thursday afternoon, which meant this was a deliberate visit. He had the smooth, surface-level pleasantness of a man who had decided to try a different approach. Miss Whitmore, he said, I wanted to apologize for my behavior the last time I was in here. It was ungentlemanly. Clara looked at him. She kept her expression neutral. Thank you, she said. I've heard good things about your operation, he said. You've done well. I've worked hard, she said. Which is the same thing, mostly. He smiled. It was a better smile than last time. Practiced, warmer in the eyes. She noted the improvement. I wanted to talk to you about the festival, he said. I understand you've taken on the food operation for the East Corner. That's right. I think that's a fine idea, he said. In fact, I'd like to propose a business arrangement. I have supply connections that could help you source what you need at better prices than you're currently paying, and in return, there might be a small partnership arrangement. Nothing formal, just a way of sharing resources. Clara was quiet for a moment. That's generous, she said. It makes sense for both of us, Briggs said. You have the kitchen skill. I have the supply network. Together we'd be... Mr. Briggs, she said, my supply situation has improved considerably in the last several weeks. I've established a direct account with a supplier in Cheyenne, and my orders have been arriving correctly and on time. She let that land before continuing. I appreciate the offer, but I don't think a partnership arrangement would suit my situation. The warm smile stayed on his face, but something behind it shifted. That's a shame, he said. Things can change quickly out here. Supply networks are unpredictable. They can be, she agreed, which is why I've been careful to establish multiple sources rather than relying on any single network. She met his eyes. I've found that documentation and redundancy solve most supply problems. The smile was entirely different now, still present but thin. You're a cautious woman, he said. I grew up needing to be, she said. He put his hat back on. Well, he said, the offer stands if you change your mind. I'll remember that, she said. He left. Clara stood at the counter and breathed carefully for a count of 10 and then went back to the prep work because there was a festival in 3 days and she had 40 pounds of dried beans to get through and she was not going to let Harlan Briggs cost her an afternoon. Bess appeared in the doorway. What did he want? He wanted to be involved in something I've built, Clara said, which is what men like that always want. They don't build things. They attach themselves to things other people have built. Bess was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Are you scared? She asked. Clara thought about it honestly because Bess was 17 and deserved honesty and not performance. A little, she said, but scared and stopped are different things. Tosh, well... The festival morning arrived overcast, which worried Clara for about an hour before she decided the temperature was actually better for hot food service and stopped worrying about it. She and Bess and Dora had the tent set up by 7, the fire going by 7:30, and the first pot of stew ready by 8:15. They had brought enough cornbread batter for 12 batches, and Clara had found, through careful calculation, that she could turn a batch every 22 minutes in the cast iron pans over the fire if she managed the heat correctly. By 10 o'clock, there was a line. Not a polite, small town, a few people curious line. A real line. Families with children, ranch hands who had driven in from the surrounding county, older couples who had been coming to the festival for a decade and had never had anywhere to sit down and eat. Clara worked the stew pot, Bess managed the bread and the collecting of payment, and Dora ran the table setup with the particular organized authority of a woman who had been managing a business alone for 6 years and had exactly 0 patience for inefficiency. Eli came at 11. She saw him before he saw her, or rather, she saw him standing at the edge of the festival ground, at the line where the grass met the packed dirt of the main gathering area, with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who was not sure he'd made the right decision. He was wearing clean clothes, which she noticed. He'd shaved. He looked like himself, but slightly less defended, which she suspected was what he looked like when he was making an effort he didn't want to be caught making. She could not leave the stew pot. She raised a hand at him across the crowd, and he saw it, and something in his face changed, the uncertain quality going out of it, replaced by something steadier. He came and stood at the side of the tent, out of the flow of people, and watched her work. He did not get in the way. He did not try to help without being asked. He just stood there, present, which was not nothing. It was, actually, quite a lot. Ruth Mackey came through the line at noon and stopped when she saw Eli. "Eli Morrow," she said, with an expression that was careful not to be too much of anything. "I haven't seen you at the festival since—" She stopped herself. "Since a while." "Ruth," he said. "It's good you're here," she said, and moved on, and that was all, and it was exactly right. James Morrison came through with his wife and 2 of his daughters at noon. His wife, a quiet, dark-haired woman named Helen, shook Clara's hand over the serving table and said, "My husband told me you spoke at the ranch. He said you were straightforward." "I try to be," Clara said. "That's not as common as it should be," Helen Morrison said, and accepted her bowl of stew with the air of someone who had been hungry for exactly this for some time. Morrison lingered after his family had found a table. He looked at Clara with the assessing expression she'd seen at the ranch. "You're doing well today," he said. "It's a good crowd," she said. "Briggs's supply tent is half empty," Morrison said. He said it without pleasure, just observation. He had 2 young men selling cured jerky and some canned goods. Nobody's lined up. "People know what they want," Clara said. Morrison nodded. He looked like he was going to say something else, and then he did. "I want you to know," he said, "that I have had certain conversations about your lease that I did not fully disclose to you. I should have. And I want you to know that I have no intention of acting on any suggestion that would require me to break an agreement I made in good faith." Clara held very still. "I appreciate you telling me that," she said. "My wife would be very disappointed," he said, "if she couldn't get your bread anymore." And then he went to find his family, and Clara stood at the stew pot with her ladle in her hand and let the information settle into her, the particular relief of a threat receding, which did not feel like triumph, but felt like the restoration of solid ground under feet that had been braced for longer than she'd realized. She looked across the tent to where Eli was still standing at the side, and he was watching her, and when their eyes met, he nodded once. The small nod that meant he'd seen, he understood, and it was what he'd expected. She turned back to the stew pot. She served 143 people that day. She counted because she kept the ticket stubs, because she kept records of everything, because that was who she was. She ran out of cornbread at 2 in the afternoon, and Bess improvised a second grain bread that was not as good but sold out in 30 minutes anyway. Dora managed the tables without a single complaint, which was how Clara knew she had genuinely enjoyed herself. At the end of the day, when the crowd was thinning and the fire was banked, and Bess was washing the pots, and Dora was counting the proceeds with the focused attention of someone who liked numbers, Eli came to where Clara was sitting on a barrel outside the back of the tent, her feet on the ground, and her hands in her lap, and her back straight with the particular exhaustion of someone who has given everything they had to a day and has no regrets about it. He sat down on the ground beside her, his back against the tent frame, and did not say anything for a while. "How much did you make?" he said finally. Enough, she said. More than enough. Morrison spoke to you, he said. How did you know? His face, coming back to his wife. He's a man who feels better when he's done the right thing. Eli looked at his hands. He'll stand. I think so, she said. The festival was winding down around them, the sounds of it settling, children less frantic, conversation slower, the particular quality of a gathered day beginning to come apart into all the separate lives it was made of. I'm glad you came, Claire said. Today. You were right, he said. He considered his word choice with the seriousness he brought to everything. It was good to be somewhere. She looked at him, this man who had spent 3 years keeping himself apart from things, sitting on the ground outside a food tent at a county festival because she had asked him to come and he had decided she was worth listening to. Eli, she said. He looked at her. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you to hear it as plainly as I mean it. He waited. I'm not trying to fix you, she said. I don't think you're broken. I think you're a person who had something terrible happen and who has been getting through it the best way he knew how, and I respect that. She stopped. But I also think the way you've been getting through it has been lonelier than it needed to be. And I think you know that. He was very quiet. I'm not going anywhere, she said. That's what I wanted you to know. Whatever this is, whatever we're doing, I'm not going to disappear on you. She had not planned to say it. It had come up from somewhere below the planning. He looked at the ground for a long moment. When he looked up, his face had the quality she'd seen only a few times before. Unguarded, fully present, the face of a man who was not yet sure what to do with what he was feeling, but was no longer pretending he wasn't feeling it. Clara, he said. You don't have to say anything, she said. I know, he said. I want to. He was quiet again, and this time it was the quiet of someone choosing words for something that matters. I haven't let myself want anything in 3 years. Not really. I've worked, and I've kept things running, and I've told myself that was enough. He stopped. And then you drove up to my ranch with a saddlebag that needed fixing, and you told me my fencing was careful before you even got to the door, and you said it like you'd been paying attention, like you actually saw it, and He stopped again. Eli. I didn't know what to do with that, he said. I still don't, completely, but I know I don't want you to stop. The evening light was coming in low and warm from the west, the overcast finally breaking as the day ended, the way that happens sometimes. A whole gray day resolved in an hour of gold. Clara looked at this difficult, careful, slowly opening man sitting on the ground beside her, and she felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since the first Thursday she drove out on the Ridge Road. I'm not stopping, she said. He nodded. He reached out and put his hand briefly over hers, on the barrel between them, one moment direct and deliberate, the warmth of it fully present, and then he took it back and looked at the settling festival around them. You need help loading the tent, he said. I do, she said. He stood and offered his hand to help her up, and she took it, and when they went back into the tent, Dora looked at both of them with an expression that said she had opinions she was choosing not to share, which was, for Dora, a remarkable act of restraint. The tent came down, the wagon was loaded, the day was done, and it had been, by any honest measure, a very good day. The week after the festival, Harlan Briggs filed a formal complaint with the Clearwater Town Council. Clara learned about it on a Monday morning from Ruth Mackey, who arrived 20 minutes before the bakery opened and knocked on the back door with the specific rhythm of someone who had information that couldn't wait until 7 o'clock. Clara let her in and put coffee on without being asked, and Ruth sat at the work table and laid it out plainly, the way she laid out everything. The complaint alleged that Clara's food operation at the festival had been conducted without proper commercial certification from the county health board, that she had operated in direct competition with an established vendor without proper festival authorization, and that the proceeds she had donated to the festival fund constituted an improper financial inducement to secure her spot over other vendors. Clara listened to all of it. She poured the coffee. She sat down. How serious is this? She said. The health board certification claim is the most serious, Ruth said. The other two are thin, and anyone with sense can see it. But the certification question is a real question, and if Briggs pushes it with the right council members, It could require you to stop food service until you obtain the documentation. How long does that take? In Clearwater? Weeks, possibly, depending on who's doing the processing and how much pressure is applied to slow it down. Ruth held her coffee cup. The council meets Thursday. The complaint will be on the agenda. Thursday. Clara had 4 days. She thought about Aldrich's letter, about documentation and redundancy, about the advice she had already been given and had already been following, and about the particular frustration of having done everything right and still being caught in something wrong. What do I need to show them? She said. That your operation was safe and legitimate, Ruth said. That you followed standard practice. That the complaint is without basis. I cooked in my own kitchen, Clara said. All the food was prepared fresh. I had no spoilage, no complaints, no incidents. I served 143 people. I know that, Ruth said. You need to make the council know it. Who on the council is reasonable? Ruth considered this with the careful fairness she applied to people she had opinions about. Harold Fitch sits on the council. He'll be fair because he's constitutionally unable to be otherwise. Margaret Hale is reasonable. Thomas Ord is Briggs's man, has been for 10 years. Don't waste your breath on him. She paused. The deciding vote, if it comes to one, is likely Warren Gill. He runs the mill. He's cautious, doesn't like conflict, will go whichever direction feels safest. Then I need to make supporting me feel safer than opposing me, Clara said. Yes, Ruth said. That's exactly what you need to do. What? She went to see Eli that afternoon. She did not wait for Thursday. He was in the stable when she arrived, and he came out when he heard the wagon, and she could tell from the way he looked at her face that he already knew something had happened. She told him. He listened. He asked 3 specific questions, which were the 3 questions she would have asked in his position. Who filed it? Who decides? And what's the timeline? And she answered them and then waited. Jill, he said. Warren Gill. That's what Ruth thinks. She's right. He leaned against the paddock fence. Jill and I were in a dispute 3 years ago over water access on the north boundary. He was wrong, and he knew it, and he eventually agreed with me, but it took him 4 months and he didn't like doing it. He looked at the hills. He's not a dishonest man. He's a careful man, which in a situation like this might be the same problem. Do you have standing with him? Clara asked. Some, Eli said. I wouldn't call it friendly, but he respects me, I think, because I was right about the water, and I didn't make it ugly when he came around. Would you speak to him before Thursday? He looked at her. I was going to suggest it, he said. She nodded. And I need to prepare something for the council, documentation of everything I did at the festival, every food preparation step, every safety measure, every receipt. Your ledger. It's all in the ledger, she said. I just need to organize it into something the council can follow. He was quiet for a moment, then said, Come inside. I'll help you with the structure of it. She looked at him. I've written 2 formal statements to councils and 1 to a land board, he said. I know how they need to read. She had not known that. There were still things she didn't know about him, and each time she learned one, it shifted something slightly in her understanding, like adding a piece to a picture she'd thought was mostly finished. They sat at his kitchen table. She had never been inside the house before, only the porch, and she saw immediately what he'd meant when he said Alice had made it into something. The house had a quality that was not neglect exactly, but was the absence of active habitation. Things were clean, maintained, but nothing had moved in a long time. A woman's things were still visible. A quilt folded on the back of the rocking chair, a small pitcher on the windowsill that had been there long enough to leave a ring on the wood. Eli did not remark on any of it, and she did not either, and they sat at the table and worked. He was methodical in a way that surprised her, not because she thought him careless, but because the precision of it was a different kind from his physical precision with horses and leather. He asked her what she had done, step by step, from the preparation of the food in her kitchen to the serving of it at the festival, and he wrote it out in the architectural handwriting she'd noticed on her first visit, and then he reorganized it into the form a council would expect to see. Date, action, safety consideration addressed, outcome. They need to see that nothing was improvised, he said, that every step was considered before you took it. Nothing was improvised, she said. I know, he said. This is about making them see what you already know. They worked for 2 hours, his ranch hand. Benson knocked once, and Eli said, "Later," without looking up, and Benson went away without complaint, which told Clara something about how he ran his operation, not tyrannically, but with a clarity of priority that people understood and worked around. When they finished, she had 4 pages that were the most organized documentation of anything she had ever produced. "This is good," she said. "It's accurate," he said. "Same thing for this purpose." She looked at him across the table. He had been bent over the pages for 2 hours with the same quality of attention he brought to stitching leather, and she watched him now reread the last page with his thumb moving slightly along the margin, and she thought, not for the first time and not with surprise, that this man was made of more rooms than she had initially seen, and she had been given access to more of them than she'd expected, and she did not take that lightly. "Eli," she said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for this. For all of it." He held her gaze for a moment, and his expression had the quality she'd come to recognize, the openness that appeared when he wasn't monitoring himself. "You'd do the same," he said. "I would," she said. "But that doesn't mean it doesn't count." He nodded, a small nod, and looked back at the pages, and that was the end of it, except that it wasn't, because nothing between them ended simply anymore. It just continued at a different frequency, underneath the practical surface of things. Eli went to see Warren Gill on Wednesday afternoon. He told Clara about it Thursday morning, arriving at the bakery before she opened, which he had never done before. She let him in the back and gave him coffee, and he sat at the work table and told it plainly. Jill had been cautious, as expected. He had listened to Eli and asked careful questions about Clara's operation, the food preparation, whether there had been any complaints from festival attendees. Eli had answered all of them, and then said, in the direct manner that was his only manner, that the complaint was from a man who had been trying to drive Clara Whitmore out of Clearwater since the week she arrived, and that the council should consider the source before lending it weight. "How did he take that?" Clara asked. "He didn't like it," Eli said. "He doesn't like being told what to consider, but he also didn't disagree with it, which is the best you can get from Jill on short notice." "Do you think he'll support me?" "I think he'll wait to see which way the room is going and then support it," Eli said, "which means you need the room." The room meaning Fitch and Hale. "Fitch will be fine. Hale, do you know her?" "Slightly. She came into the bakery twice." "Is she the kind of woman who makes up her mind early and holds it?" Clara thought about it. "Yes," she said. "She's decisive. She doesn't like uncertainty." "Then go see her today," Eli said. "Before the meeting, give her your documentation. Let her make up her mind before she's in a room with Thomas Ord and Briggs." "Briggs will be at the meeting?" "He filed the complaint," Eli said. "He'll be there." Clara drank her coffee and thought about this. 4 months ago, Harlan Briggs had dropped her bread on the floor and smiled. Since then, he had interfered with her supply chain, pressured her landlord, tried to attach himself to her festival's success, and now filed a council complaint. He was a man who did not stop, which she had understood from the beginning, but there was a particular quality to what he was doing now, the escalation of it, that told her he was not making rational calculations anymore. He was making personal ones. She had refused him in ways that had cost him in public, and that had become the thing driving him now more than any practical concern. That was both better and worse than purely strategic opposition. Better because personal motives made people sloppy. Worse because sloppy and powerful was still dangerous. She went to see Margaret Hale at 10 o'clock. Hale ran the dry goods store on the east end of Main Street. Not the largest operation in Clearwater, but the most reliably stocked, which Clara had noticed and appreciated, because reliability was the thing that separated a genuine business from a performance of one. Hale was 60, brisk, efficient, with the kind of direct eye contact that came from decades of transactions that required immediate judgments about whether people were reliable. Clara put her documentation on the counter without preamble. "You've seen the complaint," she said. "I'm on the council," Hale said. "I've seen it. This is a record of everything I did at the festival. Every preparation step, every safety measure, every item sold. My kitchen record's going back to when I opened." Clara kept her hands flat on the counter. "I'd like you to read it before tonight." Hale picked up the first page. She read it with the focused speed of someone who read documents regularly, and knew what she was looking for. She went through all 4 pages, set them down, looked at Clara. "Your preparation kitchen is your commercial premises," Hale said. "Yes." "And you've had no health complaints, no incidents?" "In 4 months of operation," Clara said. "No." "The certification question," Hale said. "Have you looked into what's actually required by county statute for commercial food service at a festival event?" "I have," Clara said. "Since Ruth told me about the complaint, I've been looking into it. The county statute for temporary food service at permitted public events, and the summer festival is a permitted event, does not require separate commercial certification if the food is prepared in a licensed commercial kitchen. My bakery is a licensed commercial premises. The food at the festival was prepared there." Hale looked at her. "You're certain of this?" "I have the county statute document," Clara said. "I can have it at the meeting tonight." "Where did you get a copy of the county statute?" "I sent a wire to the county clerk in Laramie on Monday," Clara said. "They sent it by return post yesterday." Something moved in Hale's expression. Not surprise exactly, but the specific recognition of a particular kind of person. "You wired the county clerk," Hale said. "I had 4 days," Clara said. Hale picked up the documentation again and looked at the last page. "This is organized well." "I had help with the structure," Clara said. "Morrow," Hale said. It was not a question. Clara did not answer it. Hale set the papers down. "The complaint is filed," she said. "Appears to lack a factual basis if your reading of the statute is correct, which I will verify myself this afternoon." She straightened the pages. "I don't like complaints without basis. I don't like them on general principle, and I particularly don't like them when they're filed by people using the council process as a business instrument." She did not say Briggs's name. She did not need to. "Thank you for coming to me," Hale said. "Thank you for listening," Clara said. She was at the door when Hale said, "Miss Whitmore, that cornbread at the festival, the recipe is your own?" Clara turned. "My mother's, with some adjustments." "I'd like to buy some," Hale said. "Properly, on a regular basis." She said it without warmth, but with a directness that was better than warmth. "If that's convenient for you." "Standing order," Clara said. 2 loaves a week. I'll start Friday." She left the dry goods store and stood on the boardwalk in the August morning and allowed herself, for approximately 10 seconds, to feel the particular satisfaction of a thing going right that you had worked very hard to make go right. Then she went back to her kitchen because she had a full day before a council meeting she needed to be sharp for. Yet, the meeting room above the feed store was crowded in a way that surprised her, and then didn't. News traveled fast in Clearwater, and the nature of the complaint, and who had filed it and against whom, was the kind of thing people had opinions about. She recognized faces from the festival. She recognized Ruth and Dora, who were sitting together near the back with the coordinated positioning of women who had arrived early enough to get the seats that gave them the best view of everything. Eli was there. He was standing near the side wall, hat in hand, in the same posture he'd used at the festival's edge, present but not announcing himself. He caught her eye when she came in and nodded, and she nodded back, and then she went to the front table where she'd been asked to sit. Harlan Briggs was on the other side of the room with Thomas Ord beside him. He looked at her when she sat down, and he had the composed, confident expression of a man who believed he had arranged things correctly. Warren Gill opened the meeting. He read the complaint in full, which took several minutes and was written in the elaborate language of a man who had paid someone to draft it. Then he asked Clara to respond. She stood. She had the documentation. She had the county statute. She had 4 months of ledger records. She spoke for 12 minutes, clearly and without rushing, presenting each piece of information in the order that made the clearest argument, and she did not look at Briggs while she spoke. She looked at Jill and at Fitch and at Hale. When she finished, there was a silence in the room. Thomas Ord spoke first, which was expected. He had prepared questions that were not really questions but restatements of the complaint in different language, and Clara answered each one with the same evenness she'd used throughout. Fitch asked 2 practical questions about the county statute, and she answered them. Hale said nothing, which meant she had already decided. Then Briggs was given the floor. He stood and spoke with the ease of a man who was accustomed to rooms like this going his way. He made his points about certification and competition and the impropriety of the festival donation with the smooth confidence of someone who had prepared the argument carefully. He was, Clara had to admit, a skilled speaker. He made things that were not true sound reasonable, which was a particular talent and not an admirable one. He finished. He sat down. Jill looked at his hands for a moment and then looked up. "I have a question for Mr. Briggs," he said. Briggs looked at him with the slight surprise of a man who had expected the chairman to call a vote. "The complaint references improper festival authorization," Jill said. "Mr. Fitch, who manages the festival layout, is present. Mr. Fitch, was Miss Whitmore's tent authorized?" Fitch, from his counsel seat, said, "Yes, she came to me through proper channels. I drew up the agreement myself. Everything was in order." "Thank you," Jill said. "Mr. Briggs, the complaint also references commercial certification. Miss Whitmore has provided the relevant county statute indicating no separate certification is required for preparation in a licensed commercial premises for a permitted event. Can you point me to the specific statute you're relying on for the contrary position?" A silence. Briggs's lawyer, who was sitting beside him, leaned in and said something quietly. "We'll need to research the specific citation," Briggs said. "You filed the complaint last week," Jill said. "I would have expected the research to precede the filing." Something changed in the room. It was not dramatic. It was a small shift in attention, the way a group of people collectively recalibrate when they understand what they're looking at. Clara felt it and kept her face still. Briggs said, "I stand by the substance of the complaint regardless of the specific citation." "I'm sure you do," Jill said. "But the council operates on specifics, not substance." He looked at his papers. "I'd like to hear from the council on whether to sustain or dismiss." Fitch said dismiss immediately. Hale said dismiss. Ord said sustain, which surprised no one. Jill looked at his papers for a moment longer than necessary, and Clara thought, just for a second, that she might have been wrong about him, that his caution might pull him the wrong way under the pressure of Briggs's presence in the room. Then he said, "Dismiss." The complaint was dismissed. The room exhaled. Not loudly. This was a council meeting, not a theater. But the particular quality of the air changed in the way it does when something has been resolved. Clara gathered her papers. Her hands were steady. She had made sure of that specifically going into the meeting because she knew that the moment after a decision is when people look at you and what they see becomes the story. She heard Briggs say something to Ord quietly as she stood. She could not make out the words, but she heard the tone, which was not acceptance. Men like Briggs did not accept. They recalibrated and tried again from a different angle. She knew that. She had always known it. Tonight was not the end of it. But it was a piece of it, a real and documented piece, and she filed it in the ledger in her mind the same way she filed everything else. Outside, the evening had cooled. Ruth and Dora were already on the boardwalk, and Ruth said, "Well done," in the clipped way that from her was equivalent to considerable enthusiasm. And Dora said, "I've never enjoyed watching a man discover he's done his homework wrong quite so much," which was, from Dora, practically celebratory. Clara thanked them. She meant it without reservations. Eli came out a few minutes later. He had stayed to the end, as she'd known he would. He came to where she was standing and looked at her and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Jill did the right thing." "He did," she said. "He didn't enjoy doing it," Eli said. "Briggs will remember that." "I know." "So will Jill," Eli said, which cuts the other way. She looked at him. "You're saying Jill will be less willing to rule against me again." "I'm saying Jill is a man who doesn't like being put in uncomfortable positions," Eli said. "Briggs put him in one tonight. He won't forget who created the situation." Clara thought about this. "So Briggs may have spent political credit tonight that he can't easily recover." "Maybe," Eli said, "or he finds a different approach that doesn't go through the council." He said it evenly, not to frighten her, but because he was the kind of person who looked at what was true. "He'll keep trying," she said. "Yes," Eli said. "He will, but he's lost 2 rounds now, festival, council. He wanted to push you out quietly, and instead he's made himself visible, doing it." He paused. "That changes his options." They walked down the boardwalk together toward where she'd tied her wagon. The town was quieter now, the meeting having dispersed into the ordinary evening. A lamp burned in the window of the hardware store, where George Pell was still working, as he always was. "I need to tell you something," Eli said. She looked at him. His voice had changed from the flat, analytical quality it had when he was working through a problem to something more careful. "I've been offered a contract," he said. "A cattle drive north. 3 months. Good money. The man who offered it came by the ranch this week." She waited. "I told him I'd think about it," Eli said. "I haven't taken a drive in 2 years. I used to take them every year before, so—" He stopped, started again. Before Alice," she said. "Yes." He was quiet. "It's good money. The ranch could use the winter reserve, and there's part of me that—" He stopped again, and this time it was not because he was being careful with words, but because he was uncertain of them. "What part?" she asked. "There's part of me that doesn't know what to do with things being better," he said. It came out rough, like something he hadn't planned to say that clearly. "The ranch is good, the work is good, and now—" He glanced at her in a way. "Things are better in ways I didn't expect, and I haven't trusted better things in a long time. Because the last time things were good—" He did not finish. He did not need to. Clara understood. She understood in the way she understood most things about him. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. The last time things had been good, they had been taken from him without warning. And now things were becoming good again, and some part of him was looking for the exit before the loss found him. "You're thinking about going," she said. "I'm thinking about whether I should want to go," he said, "which is different." She was quiet for a moment. She wanted to say don't go. She knew she wasn't going to say it. "Is the work good?" she asked. "The drive itself?" "It's hard," he said. 3 months of hard. But I know the work." "Then it's not about the work," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't." She turned to face him on the boardwalk. He was looking at her with that full, direct attention he gave things when he was not managing himself. "Eli," she said, "I told you at the festival that I'm not going anywhere. That's still true. Whatever you decide about this contract, I'll be here when you come back." "You don't know that," he said. "Briggs—" "I handled Briggs tonight," she said. "I'll handle whatever comes next. That's not your concern to carry." His jaw tightened. "It is my concern," he said. "That's the point. It is my concern, and I don't—" He stopped. He looked away and then back at her, and the look on his face was the most open she had ever seen it, and she understood that what she was seeing was not a man choosing between a cattle drive and staying. She was seeing a man realizing in real time that he had something to lose again, and that this was terrifying to him in the specific physical way that only things that matter can be. "I know," she said quietly. "I know it is." They stood there in the lamplight from George Pell's window, and she could see him working through it, the fear and the wanting and the old loss all tangled up in the new thing, and she did not try to untangle it for him because she knew that was not something she could do for another person. "Don't decide tonight," she said. "Sleep on it." He nodded. She untied the wagon. He helped her up, his hand at her elbow, the warmth of it brief and real. She picked up the reins. "Thursday," she said. He looked up at her. "Thursday," he said. She drove. The night air was cool and dry, and the stars were beginning to come out, and she thought about a man who had learned 3 years ago that the worst thing in the world could happen when you weren't looking, and who was now standing in the dark deciding whether to risk the best thing he'd found since. She had been honest with him. She would be here. But she knew, she had always known, with the practical clarity that was her specific form of wisdom, that she could not be the reason he stayed. He had to find that reason in himself, or it would never hold. She drove home and started the next morning's bread and did not let herself be afraid, because afraid and stopped were different things, and she was not a woman who stopped. But she checked the door twice before she slept, which was not something she usually did. And she lay awake longer than usual, listening to the Wyoming night, and hoped that whatever Eli Morrow decided when he woke in the morning was the thing he actually wanted, and not just the thing that felt safest. He did not come on Thursday. Clara opened the bakery at 7, worked through the morning rush, sent Bess home at noon, cleaned the counter twice for no reason, and told herself that people miss Thursdays sometimes, and it meant nothing specific. She told herself this with the same practical firmness she applied to most things, and it worked about as well as it usually did when she was trying not to feel something she was already feeling. By Friday, she knew he had taken the contract. She knew it the way you know certain things in a small town. Not from a single source, but from the accumulation of small signals that add up faster than any one person realizes. Benson, his ranch hand, came in for coffee on Friday morning and was quieter than usual and didn't meet her eyes when he paid. George Pell said when she came in for a box of nails that he'd heard Morrow had ridden out 2 days prior, heading north. Ruth Mackey said nothing at all on her Friday visit, which was its own kind of information. Clara did not ask anyone to confirm it. She did not need to. She went home that evening and sat at her kitchen table and did not start the bread immediately, which was unusual. She sat for a while in the particular quiet of a house where a person is reckoning with something they knew was possible and had prepared for and still found harder than expected. She was not angry. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. She was not angry, because she had known from the beginning that Eli Morrow was a man making his way out of something large and slow, and she had known that the path out of it was not going to be straight. She was something more complicated than angry. She was disappointed in the specific way you are disappointed when someone you believe in doesn't yet believe in themselves. She had told him she would be here when he came back. She meant it. But she also understood, sitting at that table in the August dark, that believing in a person's capacity to find their way was not the same as being certain they would. Some people didn't. Some people chose the cattle drive and the hard road and the known thing over and over until the years ran out and the choice stopped being available. She started the bread. She was not a woman who stopped. September came in with the particular sharpness of Wyoming autumn, not cold yet, but with the edge of cold in it, like a warning. Clara expanded the bakery hours, added a Thursday soup service that became immediately popular, and hired Bess Arnott full-time at a wage that made Bess's mother come in person to shake her hand. The Cheyenne supplier had proven reliable, and the supply problem Briggs had created was functionally solved. The lease ran until the following spring, and James Morrison, true to his word, had given no indication of wavering. Harlan Briggs had gone quiet. Not gone. She was not naive enough to think he had given up, but quiet, in the way that storms sometimes go quiet before they reorganize. She kept her records. She kept her documentation. She kept the letter from Aldrich and the county statute copy and the dismissed complaint in the ledger box, and she added to it regularly because she understood that the argument was not over, only paused. She was, by any honest accounting, doing well. The bakery was making money. She had real friendships in this town, Ruth and Dora and Bess, and in the careful transactional way of practical people who respect each other, Margaret Hale. James Morrison's wife Helen had become a regular and brought her daughters on Saturdays, and there was something in that, a family coming to her table on a Saturday morning, that meant more to Clara than she would have found easy to explain. She was building the things she had come to Clearwater to build. She knew that. She also knew there was a man somewhere north of here on a cattle drive who had left without saying goodbye, and that she thought about him more than was strictly convenient. Dora, who noticed everything and usually waited to be asked before sharing it, said on a Tuesday in mid-September, "You're allowed to be bothered by it, you know." Clara was wiping down the counter. She did not stop wiping. "I know," she said. "You don't have to perform being fine," Dora said. "Not with me." Clara set down the cloth. She looked at Dora. "I'm actually fine," she said. "That's not performance. I meant what I told him. I'll be here when he comes back. But being fine about it doesn't mean it doesn't feel like something." "What does it feel like?" Dora asked. Clara thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. "Like waiting for weather you know is coming," she said. "You can see the clouds. You don't know exactly when, and in the meantime, you just do what you're doing." Dora drank her coffee and was quiet for a moment. "He'll come back," she said. "I know," Clara said. "You're very certain about that." "I'm certain about who he is," Clara said, "not about what he'll choose. Those are different things." Dora looked at her with the particular expression she used when she thought someone had said something worth keeping. She did not say anything more about it. Nuts. The thing with Briggs broke in October, and it broke in a way Clara had not anticipated, which was the nature of things with men like Briggs. They didn't do the thing you were braced for. They did the thing at an angle. A woman came into the bakery on a Wednesday morning. She was perhaps 40, thin, with the careful, watchful expression of someone who had learned to measure the room before saying anything. She asked for coffee and a roll and sat at the window table and drank the coffee and then sat for a while without leaving, and Clara eventually went and sat across from her because it was mid-morning and the bakery was quiet, and the woman had the look of someone who had come with a purpose and was working up to it. Her name was Frances Cole. She had a small farm 6 miles east of Clearwater. She had been dealing with Harlan Briggs for 2 years over a water rights dispute on her eastern boundary, and she was losing. And she had heard, she said this carefully, watching Clara's face, that Clara Whitmore was a woman who knew how to keep records and who knew people who understood legal documents. Clara listened to all of it. Frances had no lawyer. She had the original deed to her property and a collection of letters from Briggs's man that she had kept in a box because something had told her to keep them, and she had a clear understanding of what was happening to her land and no understanding of what to do about it. "He's been moving the fence line," Frances said. "Not a lot. 4 feet here, 6 feet there. Over 2 years it adds up." "Do you have the original survey?" Clara asked. "I have the deed," Frances said. "The deed references the survey. I don't have the survey itself." "Where would the survey be?" "County Records Office in Laramie, I think." "I never needed to look for it before." Clara was quiet for a moment, thinking. Fence line encroachment done gradually over time. It was the same patience that Briggs applied to everything. Small moves, nothing dramatic, accumulation. "May I see the letters?" Clara asked. Frances brought out an envelope from her coat. Clara read through the letters carefully. They were written in the smooth, legible hand of a man who knew what he was doing. Never explicit, never admitting to anything, but making clear in every line that Frances's situation was precarious and that the most practical resolution would be to come to an agreement with Briggs about the water access. "He wants the water," Clara said. "He wants everything," Frances said. "The water's the start." Clara thought about Aldrich and Laramie. She thought about the attorney he had recommended in Cheyenne, whose name was Hargrove. She thought about the county statute copy she had requested by wire and received in 2 days. "Here's what I can do," Clara said. "I can write to the county records office in Laramie today and request a copy of the original survey for your property. I can write to an attorney named Hargrove in Cheyenne who handles land disputes. He was recommended to me by a reliable source. I can help you organize your letters and the deed in a way that tells a clear story." She paused. "I'm not a lawyer. I can't give you legal advice, but I can help you get what you need in front of someone who can." Frances looked at her. Her eyes had a quality that Clara recognized, the particular look of a woman who has been managing something alone for so long that being offered help registers as a kind of shock. "Why would you do that?" Frances said. "Because Briggs has been trying to do to me what he's doing to you," Clara said. "Different method, same intention. And because I know what it's like to be a woman trying to hold something together when someone with more power has decided your hold on it is inconvenient." Frances was quiet. "Also," Clara said, "because the letters you have may document something that affects more than just your property, and if that's the case, the attorney needs to see them." She sent the wires that afternoon. Within 3 weeks, it became clear that Frances Cole's situation was not unique. The attorney Hargrove came up from Cheyenne in early November at Clara's request. He was a compact, methodical man of 50 who billed fairly and took notes constantly, and said, after reviewing Frances's documents, that he had seen variations of this approach before. Gradual encroachment, supply leverage, legal intimidation through implication rather than direct claim. He asked Clara if she knew of other landowners in the area who might have similar experiences with the same party. She thought of Ruth. Ruth thought of 3 names. Those 3 names produced 5 more. Within 10 days, Hargrove had spoken with 8 landowners in and around Clearwater who had separate but structurally similar disputes with Harlan Briggs. Fence lines, water rights, supply dependencies, lease pressures. Each one had kept some records. None of them had connected their situation to the others. Clara had a ledger. She sat with Hargrove at her kitchen table 3 evenings in a row and helped him build the map of it. Not the legal argument, which was his work, but the timeline and the pattern, which was the thing she was good at. Every date, every action, every name, every document. The same methodical intelligence she had applied to her supply chain and her council presentation applied now to something larger. "You understand what you've assembled here," Hargrove said on the 3rd evening. "I understand it's a pattern," Clara said. "What it means legally, you'd have to tell me." "It means," Hargrove said carefully, "that one person acting alone against Harlan Briggs has very little standing. 8 people with documented parallel experiences have considerably more." He looked at the pages spread across her table. "This is going to take time, and it will cost money these people don't have." "What kind of time?" 6 months, possibly a year. "And the money?" "Shared across 8 parties, it becomes more manageable. If I take it on contingency for the land cases, the fence encroachments are the clearest. I can reduce the upfront costs significantly." He paused. "I want to be honest with you. I can't promise an outcome. Briggs has resources and local relationships. But what you've built here gives these people a genuine chance they didn't have before." Clara thought about a woman named Frances Cole coming into her bakery with letters in an envelope and the watchful expression of someone who had been managing alone too long. "Tell me what they need to do," she said. She was up past midnight that night writing letters. November in Clearwater was cold in the bone-deep way of northern Wyoming, and Clara had learned to start the fire an hour before she needed it and to keep a second pair of socks near the stove. The bakery was warmer than anywhere else on the block and had become, on cold mornings, a place where people stopped not just for bread, but for the particular warmth of a room where something was being made and someone was glad you were there. She had not heard from Eli. She had not expected to. A cattle drive north meant no reliable post, no easy way to send word. She knew this. It did not make the knowing easier. She thought about him sometimes in the way you think about weather you are waiting for. Not constantly, not with urgency, but with a steady background awareness that something was unresolved and that the resolution was not in her hands. She had done what she could do, which was be honest with him. The rest was his. Dora said one morning in November, "Benson was in for laundry. He said the drive was due back by end of month." Clara kept her eyes on the bread she was shaping. "Did he say anything else?" "He said Morrow had sent word the drive was going well," Dora said. "That's all." "That's something," Clara said. "Yes," Dora said. "It is." She did not let herself count days. She was too busy to count days, and counting days was a form of holding on that she had decided was not useful. She had her work and her records and her people and the 8 landowners whose case was now with Hargrove in Cheyenne and the regular letters she received from him updating her on the filing process. She had more than enough to fill her days, and she filled them. Tut. He came back on a Thursday. Of course it was a Thursday. She heard the wagon in the street before she saw it, the specific sound of a heavy working vehicle, not the light rattle of her own. She was behind the counter, and she did not go to the window immediately because she was not going to do that to herself. She finished serving Ruth Mackey, who had been watching her face for the last 30 seconds with an expression of careful neutrality, and then she turned around and went to the window. He was tying the horse at the post across the street. He looked like a man who had spent 3 months on the trail, not ruined by it, but used by it, leaned down and trail-worn, with the particular quality of someone who has been reduced to the essentials and is recalibrating what the non-essentials feel like. He stood at the post for a moment before he turned, and when he turned toward the bakery she could see him collecting himself, which was something she had not seen him do before. He came in. The bell above the door rang, and Ruth Mackey found a reason to examine her coffee with great attention. And the 2 other customers at the window table went very still in the way people go still when they understand they're about to be present for something. Eli stood in the doorway of Clara Whitmore's bakery with his hat in his hands, and he looked at her behind the counter, and he looked like a man who had ridden a very long way to get to a specific place and had just arrived at it and was not entirely sure he deserved to. Clara looked at him. "You're back," she said. "I'm back," he said. She picked up the coffee pot and poured a cup and set it on the counter and went back to the bread she'd been preparing because she was not going to make it harder than it needed to be for him. He came to the counter and sat on the stool and wrapped his hands around the cup. "I shouldn't have left the way I did," he said. "No," she agreed. "You shouldn't have." "I don't have a good explanation." "I think you do," she said. "I think it was fear, which is an explanation, just not a particularly comfortable one to admit." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not wrong," he said. "I know." She shaped the bread without looking up. "How was the drive?" "Hard," he said. "Cold. 3 months of exactly what I expected." "Did it help?" He was quiet again, and when he spoke, his voice was different from the careful, flat tone he usually used. Lower, more deliberate, the voice of a man who had been arguing with himself for a long time and had finally reached a conclusion. "I spent 3 months trying to get some distance from something," he said. "And what I learned was that distance doesn't fix the thing. It just gives you a lot of time alone with it." He turned the coffee cup. "I thought about Alice, about what happened and what I've been carrying since. And I thought about you, about what I was doing by leaving." She kept her hands on the bread. "And?" she said. "And I was a coward," he said. "Not in the way of not being brave. I've been brave enough when I had to be, but I was afraid of something good happening to me. Because the last time something good happened, it was taken away, and I thought, if I don't let myself have it, I can't lose it." "That's not living," Clara said. "That's just avoiding dying." "I know," he said. "I know that now." She looked up at him then. He was watching her with the full, unguarded attention she'd seen only a handful of times, but it was different now. Not conflicted, not braced, but clear. He had worked something out inside himself, and it showed. "Clara," he said, "I'm asking you. I'm not—" He stopped, started again, and she could see him trying to find words for something he did not have a practiced way of saying. "I don't want to go back to the ranch and close the door again. I don't want to spend another 3 years keeping myself at a distance from things that matter." He set down the cup. "You matter, and I was too afraid to say that before I left, and I should have said it." The bakery was very quiet. Ruth Mackey was not looking at her coffee anymore. She wasn't even pretending. Clara set the bread aside and wiped her hands on her apron and looked at this difficult, careful, slowly opening man sitting on the stool across her counter, this man who had spent 3 years building walls and 3 months tearing them down in the cold and the dark somewhere north of here, and she felt something settle in her chest that had been waiting to settle for a long time. "I told you I'd be here," she said. "I know," he said. "I meant it." "I know that too," he said, "which is the thing I kept coming back to, out on the trail. Every time I tried to convince myself it was better to stay gone, I kept coming back to knowing that you meant it." She leaned on the counter between them. "Eli," she said, "I am not a simple woman. I have a business that someone powerful is trying to undermine, and I have 8 landowners whose situation I'm now involved in, and I have a lease that runs until spring, and a supplier in Cheyenne, and a ledger full of documentation against a man who doesn't know how to stop." She held his gaze. "My life is not simple, and it's not going to be. I need you to know that." "I know that," he said, "and I need you to not disappear when it gets hard," she said. "I can handle Briggs, I can handle the council and the supply problems and all of it. What I cannot handle is someone being almost present. Either you're here or you're not." He nodded, and his nod had the weight of someone making a commitment rather than an agreement. "I'm here," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, reading his face the way she had learned to read it over these months. Not for what he was performing, but for what was true underneath it. What she saw was a man who had arrived at a decision the hard way, through the specific misery of 3 months of distance, and who was now certain of it in the particular way that you can only be certain of things you've tried to argue yourself out of and failed. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said again, and allowed herself for the first time in a long time to smile at him without managing it. Ota. What followed was not simple or quick or smooth. Nothing between them was any of those things, and that was, Clara came to understand, one of the reasons it was worth having. Eli came into town more. Not every day. He was a man who needed the ranch and the work and the specific quiet of his own land, and she did not try to change that because she understood it was not something that needed changing. But he came on Thursdays, reliably now, and sometimes on other days, and when he came, he was present in the way she had asked for. Fully there, not guarded, not half gone. He helped her with the Hargrove correspondence, bringing the same methodical precision he'd applied to her council documentation. He knew things about land law and local surveying practice that proved useful in ways she hadn't expected, and Hargrove wrote to her in December to say that the combined case was stronger than he'd initially assessed, and that he was cautiously optimistic about the fence encroachment claims. In December, Harlan Briggs received formal legal notice from Hargrove's office on behalf of Francis Cole and 4 of the other landowners. Clara was not there when he received it, but she heard about it from Ruth, who had heard it from George Pell, who had been in the feed store when Briggs came in afterward, and his manner had been, Ruth paused here, choosing her word carefully, different. Not broken, not defeated, but recalibrated, which was the same thing Eli had predicted. A man discovering that the options available to him were no longer the ones he had counted on. He did not come into the bakery. He did not file another council complaint. He did not, as far as Clara's considerable network of careful listeners could determine, approach James Morrison again. She did not celebrate this. She kept her records. She kept her documentation. She continued paying her rent on the first of each month, and continued corresponding with the Cheyenne supplier, and continued being the kind of business that a town needed enough that removing it would cost more than it gained. She understood that Briggs was not finished, only paused, and she intended to be ready for whatever the next pause ended. But she allowed herself to notice that she was less braced than she had been, that the constant low-level vigilance had eased slightly, the way a clenched muscle slowly releases when it's been held long enough. In Eli's gray horse, the one she'd watched him work in the paddock that afternoon, the trouble horse he'd found in the north pasture, gentled completely by December. She was out at the ranch on a Thursday in late November when she first saw it happen, the horse coming to him without the long line, no tension in its neck, ears relaxed, following his movement with the specific quality of an animal that has decided to trust. She watched from the fence, the cold air sharp in her lungs, and she thought that she had never quite seen the thing he did made so visible before. The patience of it, the absolute refusal to force what had to come freely, the willingness to show up day after day and let the trust accumulate at the animal's own pace. He came to the fence when the horse settled. "She's there," he said. "I saw," Clara said. He looked at the horse, then back at her. "Takes as long as it takes," he said. "Yes," she said. "It does." He looked at her steadily, and they both understood they were not only talking about the horse, and neither of them felt the need to say so. The first time he kissed her was in January, on the porch of his ranch, in the blue cold dark after a Thursday dinner that had stretched past its natural end because neither of them had wanted to stop the conversation. She had been getting her coat, and he had been holding it for her, an ordinary practical gesture. And then he had turned her toward him, and he looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd come to know best, the fully present one. And then he kissed her. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was not the kind that belongs in a story about sweeping gestures and perfect moments. It was the kiss of a man who had decided on something carefully and was doing it with full intention, and she had put her hand briefly against his chest and felt his heartbeat, which was not steady, which was the most honest thing she'd ever experienced from him. When they stepped back, he looked at her, and she could see him braced for something, for it to have been wrong, for her to have regretted it, for some consequence to arrive. "It's all right," she said. He exhaled. "I wasn't sure." "It's all right," she said again. He helped her into her coat. She climbed up to the wagon seat. The night was very clear and very cold, and the stars had that Wyoming quality of being too close. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he said. "Dit. By spring, the bakery lease came up for renewal. James Morrison offered her a 3-year term at a fair rate, and he made the offer in person, which was not what he'd been required to do. He came into the bakery on a Tuesday morning and sat at the window table, and when she came to him, he handed her the paper without preamble. 3 years, he said. Same terms as before, plus a small adjustment for the improvements you've made to the space. Clara read it. She had learned to read lease documents carefully. This is fair, she said. I'd like to think so, Morrison said. He was quiet for a moment. I want to say something, if you'll allow it. She sat across from him. I was approached about this property, he said. Last spring, you know that. I know, she said. I came close to taking the approach, he said, and he said it looking at the table, which was, she thought, harder for him than looking at her. Not because I wanted to harm your business, but because the money was significant and I had reasons for needing it. He looked up. I want you to know that I regret coming as close as I did. Clara looked at this man who had almost done something bad and had chosen not to and was now sitting in her bakery owning it to her directly. I appreciate you saying that, she said, genuinely. My wife is very fond of your bread, he said. He stood, which meant the uncomfortable part was done, and he was himself again. She'd be upset with me if anything changed that. Clara walked him to the door. He tipped his hat and left, and she watched him go and thought about the ways people make their choices. Not in grand moments of revelation, but in small, private recalibrations that nobody sees but that determine, in accumulation, the kind of person you turn out to be. She signed the lease that afternoon. In April, Hargrove wrote to tell her that 3 of the 8 land cases had settled in favor of the landowners, with 2 more expected to follow. Briggs had not admitted to anything. Men like Briggs rarely admitted to anything. But the settlements required him to restore the original survey boundaries and pay a portion of the legal costs. The water rights dispute with Francis Cole was the strongest case and was proceeding to a formal hearing. Clara read the letter at the work table and then filed it in the ledger box with everything else. And then she stood in the back of her bakery in the April morning and let herself feel the full weight of what had happened since a woman with an envelope full of letters had sat at her window table and worked up the courage to ask for help. The thing about justice, Clara had learned, was that it was slow and imperfect and rarely delivered in the form you imagined it would be. Briggs was not ruined. He was not brought to any public accounting that satisfied the outrage of what he had done. He was constrained, and some of what he had taken was returned, and some of what he had planned was prevented. That was not everything, but it was not nothing. In a world that ran mostly on power and patience, making a powerful man less comfortable was a real thing, even if it was a quiet thing. She wrote back to Hargrove. She wrote to Francis Cole. She made a pot of coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at Clearwater, Wyoming, in the April light. The mud of the spring thaw on the street, the smoke from the houses, the specific ordinary beauty of a place that was continuing to exist, as places do, whether you were paying attention or not. She had built something here. Not the thing she had imagined when she'd left Missouri with $200 and a recipe box and the particular stubbornness of women who have been underestimated their whole lives. The thing she had built was more complicated and more tangled and more interesting than what she had imagined. It included a man on a ridge road who had walled himself off from the world and who was, slowly and imperfectly and with considerable difficulty, opening the door again. It included Ruth Mackey and Dora Chen and Bess Arnott and Margaret Hale and Francis Cole and James Morrison and his wife Helen and 8 landowners who now had a legal claim where before they had only had a worry. It included 4 pages of organized documentation and a county statute obtained by wire and a dismissed council complaint and a food tent in the east corner of a festival where she had served 143 people in a single afternoon. It was not a simple thing, it was a real thing. And real things are always more complicated than simple ones, which is not a flaw, but a feature, because the complication is where all the living actually is. Eli came on Thursday, as he had every Thursday since November. He brought a piece of carved wood. He had been carving again, she had noticed, the small figures accumulating on his windowsills with a quiet persistence that moved her every time she noticed it. This one was a horse, the gray horse, captured in the posture of an animal that had decided to trust. He set it on her counter without comment. She picked it up and held it and looked at the work in it. The patience of it, all that care pressed into something small enough to hold in one hand. She's beautiful, Claire said. She's trouble, he said. Same thing he'd said in October, and this time she heard the same quality in his voice that had been there then. Not complaint, but affection. They sat on the porch that evening with coffee and the last of the apple cake she'd made that morning, and the Wyoming spring was doing the thing it did in April, where the cold and the warmth alternated hour by hour, undecided, and the light came in at an angle that made everything look briefly extraordinary before settling back into ordinary, which was the best kind of light. Eli was not a transformed man. She wanted to be honest about that, even in the privacy of her own accounting. He was still difficult sometimes, still prone to silence when he should speak, still carrying the weight of what he had lost in the particular way that people carry things that have become part of their structure. He was not going to turn into someone easy or uncomplicated, and she had never wanted him to. But he was present. He had chosen to be present, every Thursday and the other days too. And presence, she had come to understand, was not the absence of difficulty, but the willingness to stay in it. That was the whole thing, really. Not the grand gesture or the perfect moment, but the consistent, imperfect, deliberate choice to show up. She had learned that from a year of running a bakery in a town that had not expected her. You showed up before the sun came up. You made the bread even when the flour was wrong and the oven ran cold, and a man dropped your loaf on the floor and smiled. You kept your records, and you found your suppliers, and you sat with people who needed sitting with, and you drove out on ridge roads to leave food for ranch hands, and you stayed even when staying was the harder thing. That was not a heroic story. There were no dramatic rescues in it, no single moment where everything changed. It was the other kind of story, the kind made of accumulated small decisions, small acts, small moments of choosing the harder and more worthwhile thing over the easier and emptier one. Clara had been told her whole life, in various ways, that she was not the kind of woman who would end up with much. Too big, too opinionated, too difficult, too practical for her own good. She had been told she would not last a season in Clearwater. She had been told her bread was not worth the floor she stood on. She was still here. The bread was good. The town was better for her presence than it had been before she arrived. Not because she had saved anyone, but because she had built something real and let people share it, and real things, built honestly, have a way of becoming the things a place can't imagine being without. She looked at the carved horse in her hand, the small, perfect weight of it. She thought about what she knew now, at 29 years old and 1 full year into the life she had made in Clearwater that she had not known when she left Missouri. She knew that the people who see you really see you, the careful work and the fencing and the stitching and the thing you're actually made of. Those people are rare and worth the trouble of finding. She knew that grief does not end, but it does, if you let it, make room. She knew that records matter and documentation matters, and the slow, unglamorous work of building a case matters, because the world runs on evidence, and the people who understand that have something the people who rely only on power do not. She knew that sometimes the thing you come to a place for is not the thing you end up with, and the thing you end up with is better than what you came for, and you would not have found it if you had not been stubborn enough to stay. Eli put his hand over hers on the porch rail. He did it the same way he had done everything with her. Deliberately, without performance, with the full weight of intention behind it. The light was going. The cold was coming back in from the east. Somewhere on the ridge road, a mountain thrush was calling, which was late in the season for them, but there it was. "You hear that?" she said. "Thrush," he said. "Late one." "I thought they didn't stay," she said. He was quiet for a moment. His hand was warm over hers. "Some of them do," he said. The dark came in from the mountains, and the lamp in the bakery window was the warmest light on the street, and Clara Whitmore sat on the porch of her own building in Clearwater, Wyoming, and held a carved horse in her palm, and felt, without needing to name it or make it larger than it was, that she was exactly where she had chosen to be. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.